Hi everyone, I'm Swyx and I'm happy to be sharing this walkthrough with you. I learned web dev myself through freeCodeCamp 3 years ago, and back then I actually struggled a lot with getting my projects online, at first through Cloud9 and then Heroku, and I only found Netlify a year later and realized that deploying and scaling is a lot easier with the Jamstack approach, especially with modern front-end frameworks like React and Vue. So this is the video series I wish I had when I started out. I hope you enjoy. So I kind of break down the overall structure of the series into 9 parts. Don't worry, they're not all equally long, but we're going to start with the main ones first, the ones that you really need to know. So we'll talk about Netlify Edge and how Netlify is actually a CDN first hosting solution, and that's why it's fast and secure, and how we can upload and deploy without using any of the other functionality of Netlify, just deploying straight to the CDN. Next, we'll look into Netlify Build and how Netlify hooks up to your Git repos and continuously deploys from them, so you have version control for your sites, but also it helps you generate your sites from static site generators for maximum performance. We understand the build process, especially how to debug it, as well as to manage the build environment with environment variables, as well as inject your tokens and secrets at build time. Then we'll talk about Netlify Dev, which helps you develop locally so you don't even have to deploy. This is entirely within your local machine. And the idea is to make it a lot easier to test serverless functions together with your local dev environment with hot reloading, as well as anything else that you might need to simulate your real production environment. Then we'll take a look at Netlify Forms, and this covers the use case where you think you may need a server, but actually you just want to have some basic form submission capability, like a comment system, people leaving a contact form, or even file uploads. And then you want to do some basic automation with that, with Zapier or a serverless function or other sort of webhooks. And we'll show you how to do that in simple HTML, as well as single page apps and static site generators. Then we're going to take a look at Netlify Identity, which helps you add authentication and authorization to your site. And this can be very useful for apps and e-commerce solutions. And in particular, you can use a drop-in widget so you don't have to code up the UI, or you can use something lower level that actually gives you the core functionality and you can code your UI on top of it. We'll also talk about authenticated functions and how Netlify Identity and serverless functions work really well together, as well as other things that you might want to do. Some of the people that you're working with might actually be non-technical users, and you might want to edit content without going straight into source code. And that's why Netlify has a very wonderful open source project called NetlifyCMS. And we'll talk about how to set it up as well as what it does, so you can evaluate for yourself if you want to use it or use any of the other headless CMSs out there. We're then going to talk about Netlify Addons, which are all the other functionality of Netlify that doesn't really fit in the other buckets above, but are still very useful and you might want to use them on certain occasions. And in particular, I want to shout out Netlify Analytics, which are unblockable server-side analytics that would be very useful for your site, as well as the add-on marketplace, where Netlify is starting to have add-on partners that include FaunaDB, which helps you add a database to your Jamstack site. Lastly, we're going to talk about the Netlify API, where you can make your own Netlify client. For example, if the CLI and the UI of Netlify aren't exactly fitting what you need, Netlify's platform is entirely documented, and you can go make your own client on top of it, and a lot of users have. And finally, we'll end with pointers for learning more about Netlify and Jamstack, and where you can get help if you run into trouble. So hopefully that's a good overview of what we're going to be doing today, and let's start diving in. There are a few ways to deploy to Netlify. Now, Netlify drop is not the most important way, but I find it useful to explain this first because it helps explain the history of Netlify as well as the fundamental concept of Jamstack. So Netlify started life as a company called Bitballoon, and Bitballoon was a simple service where you could drag and drop like a folder on your desktop, drag it onto Bitballoon's web UI, and have it be deployed immediately onto a CDN. And to this day, that is Netlify drop. And so that is the fundamental concept of Netlify, that everything that you deploy to Netlify is static assets, and Netlify takes care of deploying it on a CDN to all the points of presence around the world so that your users get them as quickly as humanly possible. Now, Bitballoon eventually became Netlify, and then we dropped the Bitballoon angle. So if you go to the URL bar and you type in bitballoon.com, you just simply get redirected to app.netlify.com/drop. Here you can do a simple drag and drop of your built site, not the source code, the built site. And you can scroll around to look at the features. We're going to cover all of this in the rest of this video. If you don't have a sample site, Netlify actually even gives one to you. So just go to the download a demo site button. That downloads a zip file. And you can literally just drag and drop that zip file onto that drag field. And you see how quickly it deploys. There's no editing there. It just deploys live to a live URL, and you can scroll around. I mean, I really don't think there is a faster solution to getting something online. You literally drag and drop it, and the whole thing just deploys for you on a CDN. So that's the fastest solution. Now I'm also going to try to edit this site. I'm going to unzip that zip file into a folder, and then you can look around. You can see all the assets like a typical site. I'm going to choose my favorite editor. I use VS Code. It doesn't really matter what you use. But here in VS Code, I can just drag and drop the file from my file explorer to VS Code. And now I have that project open. And now I can surf around and look at the index.html, for example. And this is a standard HTML site, nothing, no frameworks, nothing. And I'm just going to edit some of the text to see how it shows up and instantly deploys changes. So now I'm saving it. And so I've edited that site, and now I can actually choose to compress that site and zip it up again to a zip file. And now I can go back to that deploy page. And if I want to update that site, I can just go down to the deploy section and drag and drop, just like I did to initiate that site. So I just drag and drop it, and now it's uploading, and now it's published. And when I click on it and I hit to refresh that site, it's uploaded with the new changes. So that's Netlify drop. You can always access the previous deploy with a unique URL. So if you click down in here, you can access the previous deploy. And you can even roll it back. So if you want, you can just say publish deploy. And now when I refresh this original URL, and I refresh it, it goes back to the original version. Because every single deploy is immutable, so you can always roll back something if you need to. And we don't expect you to drag and drop every time. So the next method I'm going to cover is using the Netlify CLI. This is a pretty big topic that actually deserves a separate video, but here we're only going to use the Netlify CLI to deploy. So I'm going to go back to the folder that I had, which I'm editing the file in, and I can pull up the terminal in VS Code. I already have the Netlify CLI installed, but if you need to, you can run npm install global netlify-cli, and that will install for you. I'm running a Netlify version of 2.12. You can run Netlify status to check if you're logged in. I am. And you can run login, Netlify login, if you're not. Now I'm going to edit my HTML again to indicate that I'm deploying from the Netlify CLI. So I'm just going to say Netlify CLI rules. So we should see that if we deploy correctly. So down in here, I'm going to write Netlify deploy. For brevity, because this is a lot to type, you can actually use NTL, and that would work. And we'll see what we get. So the first thing it tells me is that this folder isn't linked to a site. I have an existing site that I want to link to, but we'll avoid that for now and just create a new site, and we'll do the linking later. So we'll create and configure a new site. They'll ask you to pick your teams. It's likely that you'll just have one or two teams. So just pick the appropriate team, and then you can pick something like Netlify demo site. Now it's asking you for the deploy path. In most cases, you can just go with whatever is suggested, but we'll tell you how to configure this later. And so now it's uploaded all of these pieces of information and actually showed you what it's done, as well as given you a URL where you can actually go check it out. So here, because I've only chosen Netlify deploy, by default it deploys to a draft URL. So you can see what it looks like in production before you actually push it to master. If you're happy with this and you actually want to push it to master, just run netlify deploy -- prod. And that does exactly the same thing as Netlify deploy, but it pushes it directly, instead of a draft URL, it pushes it directly to. So here we have a live URL. So if we click this, we should be able to see the CLI rules on the main URL instead of the draft URL. Again, remember that each of these deployments is immutable, so you can roll back to it at any time, or give this as a link to a friend or colleague for reviewing whatever content or code changes you've been. Now notice that it keeps prompting me for a deploy path. If you want to actually just hard code that, there are a few different ways to do it, but the way that I would recommend is to create a netlify.toml file. So I'm going to exit out of this process, and I'm going to create a netlify.toml. So this is an example netlify.toml that I have just saved on my copy of my clipboard manager. We're going to comment this out for now, and we're going to focus on the publish directory. So the publish directory is the directory that we want to zip up and send out to the CDN of Netlify. Down in here, I usually use a dist folder, but here I'm just deploying the root folder, so we can just say dot. You can run netlify deploy prod, and I am no longer being asked about where my publish deploy path is. Of course, I can move all of the assets into a publish folder. So something like publish dist, and I can move all of the assets here. So now it looks a lot cleaner, and I can build from a source code directory. So then I would have to change my publish directory accordingly to the dist folder. So I only publish anything inside of this, and anything outside of this does not get. And I can run that accordingly. Now in Netlify, we actually really encourage using version control, and we call it Git-centric workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate Git. So Git init. Now you notice one new folder that was created that I haven't explained yet is the .netlify folder. It really is just a simple little JSON file that stores where you've linked, what site you've linked the project to. So for example, if over here I run netlify status, you can actually see not just my login information, but which site this particular folder, this particular project has been linked to. So it says down here netlify site info, and it gives me all that stuff. And you can notice the site ID is an exact match of state.json. So obviously this .netlify folder is pretty helpful for Netlify CLI to understand what site you've linked to, but it may not be so helpful for an open source project, for example, where people downloading your repo might not have access to the same site, so checking that in might confuse them. However, actually checking that in for a team project is probably pretty handy, so that people don't have to set up their own sites. It's really up to you, but I personally generally git ignore the Netlify folder, and it really depends on your use case whether you do that or not. So I've gone and git ignored. I'm going to edit the content over here, so we also reflect that we're deploying from Git this time, and we'll see what happens with that. So now I can say git add dot, git add everything, git commit, and show files. You can come up with a better message than I have. And now we have to set up a remote. Netlify works with GitLab, Bitbucket, and GitHub. Obviously, I am most familiar with GitHub, so I'm going to use that. But feel free to use whatever Git provider you care about. So Netlify, what am I calling it? Netlify drop down site master, and just link it here. So I can copy that URL and just say git remote add origin, and now I have that linked up. I can actually say git push master. So that when I refresh over here, I can see that I've pushed my site up to Git. So surprisingly, we've gone through two of the methods. And we're actually well set up to do continuous deploy to Netlify. And I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. So if we go to the Netlify homepage, these are all the sites that I have currently, but you can also click New Site from Git. You can choose to set up continuous deployment from one of these providers. Obviously, I choose GitHub. And I can select that repo that I just created. So you'll notice over here that it reads the netlify.toml file that we've made, and it's also created some other options that you might want to look into as well. Well, we'll talk about the build command when we get to the build section. So we're just going to hit deploy site, and it really is that simple. So this deploy should be done pretty quickly, and once you click that site, you should be able to see Netlify from Git directly as pushed from our local development to GitHub, and from GitHub pulled into Netlify. Let's have a look at what continuous deployment workflow looks like. So I'm going to go over to my deploys view, and then I'm also going to go over to my project. I'm going to make some edits as well. So I'm going to say continuous deployment is the best, because it is. I'm going to git add dot again commit change h2 and git push origin master. That's just an alias that I have set up locally. So that's going to deploy straight to GitHub, and that's going to kick off a build in here. And that's just an underlying secret about how Netlify works, is to automate this entire. So now there's no build time, so it just basically deployed immediately. And so now when I hit back to the original site, Goofy Austin 8A8, I can see continuous deployment is the best. Over in GitHub, I can also refresh and see my change down in here. And that's continuous deployment, the idea that your deploys update in lockstep with your Git. Don't forget that you can always roll things back if you made a mistake or if you're not ready to release something. So for example, I can publish this old deploy, and if I head back to the site and refresh, it goes back to the original Git message, and the next version is still here. So that's how we launch some of our features. If you want to turn off continuous deployment for some reason, you can click Stop Auto Publishing, and that will stop. And now when I make some more changes, stop publish, stop. Again, this is a Git alias just for me to be a little bit quicker in my actions. So now when I see this update coming in, it actually has built and deployed. It just isn't published yet. And you can see this little lock icon because I've stopped auto-publishing. So when I refresh my page, I haven't changed anything in terms of the text because I haven't published the latest update. If I want to kick it back on again, it doesn't immediately promote the latest deploy to the published site because you may not want that to happen. So you're going to have to go in here, deploy. And only then you'll see the new text that you've pushed to Git. So a lot of the secret around how this is done is basically setting up internal build hooks. You can actually set up your own build hooks down in here in the settings, and it just gives you a URL you can use to trigger a build. So let's have a look at how that works. So I can give this a name, for example, demo hook, and you can give it a branch to build. Here I only have master, but you can imagine building other branches. And you can save it, and that gives you a build hook with which to use. So now I'm going to, and there's a very useful curl command. So I can actually paste that into. So let's head over to the deploy section, and I'm going to bring up my terminal and copy it from the build hook section. So I'm going to see that I fired this off. And now, if I wait long enough or refresh, I can see that a new hook has been triggered by the demo hook. People use build hooks for all sorts of things. For example, you can go to if this then that and trigger builds on a tweet, for example. Or you can set a scheduled job from Zapier or any other cron service to build every minute, every day, every hour, whatever suits your build process. For example, one of my coworkers, Phil Hawksworth, actually built a clock, Set Your Watch by Netlify.com. This isn't a dynamically updated JavaScript clock. It literally builds every minute. So now if I refresh, you can actually see the time update accordingly. For the last method of deploying, it's more of a fun demo and not something you're likely to use more than once, but it's handy to have around, especially for open source projects. If you have a Netlify.toml configured correctly, then you can also set up a one-click deploy to Netlify button that's pretty easy to get going. So I'm going to go to my GitHub directory that I've set up in the course of this video. I'm going to copy that URL. I'll head to the deploy button docs on netlify.com, and I'll just paste that in here. And that will configure various things like the Markdown snippet, HTML, and Elm snippet if you use Elm. But here I'm just going to copy a Markdown snippet. What that helps me do is paste it directly into my README, so you can say things like deploy to Netlify down in here. So I'm going to commit this again. New deploy to Netlify button. And I'll push to master. And now when I refresh, I get this nice deploy to Netlify button. So it's nice to display on your docs, especially for open source boilerplates and projects, because what that enables people to do, people who are not you, is to click that button and get that one-click deploy experience. So for example, here it says connect to GitHub. I'll give this a different name. Deploy to Netlify. And it's going to set up a site and set up that continuous deployment and fork your repo, all in the process of one click. So whoever's working on their new site can get the benefits of this latest site from you, but then they also have a fork with which to start work on. So that's what the deploy to Netlify button is. It's just a streamlined process. It's useful for open source boilerplate authors and app authors. So now we're done talking about ways to deploy things on Netlify. Notice that we haven't talked about build, because that's a different stage of the deploy cycle, where you may have to set the build command, and we'll come to that in a bit. But I wanted to spend some time talking about what you get by default, because these are things where there's nothing to cover because you got it by default already, but it's good to be aware of what you get for free. So the first thing to notice is that you get HTTPS by default. So that's a more encrypted protocol where you're not susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks. And that's just a best practice for modern websites. By default, you also get deploy previews. So I'm going to do a little demo of that with our demo site. I'm going to create a new branch, a new site, new feature, for example. And I'm going to edit that in here. Awesome new feature. And I'm going to save that. And awesome feature. Pushed and git push origin new feature. And then I'm going to go create a PR on GitHub. So I've been working on a branch. I have an awesome new feature. I'll leave a comment. Please merge, create a pull request, and we'll let it perform some checks. But you can see that automatically some things happen that you may not necessarily have on a normal site. And so this is a deploy preview, basically saying that even a PR which hasn't been merged, I can actually check out over here where it says awesome new feature, and it gives me a label of deploy preview 1, and that is a preview that I can share with my clients or my coworkers. Sometimes if you're using, for example, a static site generator, you may want to check out if pages or redirects have changed. So you can click on the details, and it brings you into Netlify, where you can look at what pages have changed in particular, and that should be exactly what you expect in terms of pages. Once you're happy with your preview, you can merge it in, and that should also kick off a new build on the master branch. So that's a very nice workflow, from previewing the new feature before you merge, and then merging it in once you're happy and having your customers see it. The third default to know about is that Netlify is a CDN by default. So all of your deploys are distributed to the nearest points of presence. This isn't documented everywhere because the list keeps changing, but as of the time of this recording, the regular free tier gets a few locations: Frankfurt, Singapore, San Francisco, New York, Sao Paulo, and Sydney. And the enterprise tier gets a few more locations. Deploys are also atomic, which means that Netlify waits until all the files are published before pushing everything to production, so that your customers never see like a half updated site, no matter when they hit. And also, it also has instant rollbacks, which means that it invalidates the cache globally whenever you do a rollback, for example, by clicking an old deploy and clicking publish deploy. So here I've rolled the version back, and now it's instantly invalidated, and I can just refresh and see that old deploy. Lastly, you also get asset optimization. Now, this is not on by default, but it's so easy to turn on that I can't resist telling you about it. So if you head over to the site that we've been published and you look into the sources, you can see that we've actually not optimized this site for performance. This is obviously a super small site, so it doesn't matter, but you may want to have this on a larger site. So for example, we can minify the CSS, or also if we had any JavaScript files, we can also minify that and do a bunch of other hygienic things to clean up the way that we optimize our assets. So if we want to turn that on, head over to deploy settings and scroll down to post-processing section. And we can click on asset optimization and enable asset optimization and click save. And the last step to do in this process is to head over here and retrigger a deploy. So that will introduce asset optimization into the post-processing step, which is after you've uploaded all your files. And now, when I refresh my site, you can see that the structure of the site looks the same on the HTML side point of things, but the CSS is now minified. So this is that much faster to deliver over the wire, and it just took you a couple clicks. So we covered some nice features that you get by default. There may be others that I haven't covered. I just wanted to highlight some of these. And the last part of the deploy section is going to be about customizing the URL, the domains that your customers see. So the first thing to try is to not stick to the auto-generated ones that have been assigned to you, but just to customize what that looks like. So over here, I'm going to say something. I can go over to deploy settings, go to general, and change the site name. So over here, I can say Netlify drop demo sitemap. So now when I click over here, it has a more ergonomic site name, but it is still on the .netlify.com domain. Another feature I wanted to highlight is what happens when you want to customize the internal URL architecture within your site. So for example, let's create an About Us page and have that show up. So I'm going to create about.html. And I'm going to hollow out most of these features. Just call this About Us. And leave the rest pretty much. Okay, so now I have a new About Us page. And I'm going to change to master and commit this. new about us page and push it to master. I can hit to about and see the about us page. So that's all well and good until we tell people to go to the about us page, and they might type in /about us and get a 404 page. It's not found. So what do we do about that? So one of the ways we can handle this is to add in a redirects file. So there's some guides as to how to do that over here, but we'll just show you inside of code. So I'm just going to add a _redirects file, and this basically just tells you where to redirect from and to. So for example, if people type in about us, redirect people to about. So again, I'm going to commit this, add redirects, and I'm going to push to master. So now when I head to this about us, it's going to redirect to about. Let's do it again. About us. It redirects to about. So that's very handy, but sometimes people just type in any sorts of random stuff, and they just don't really get a nice experience. So it's nice to set up a custom 404 page. So let's also do that. I'm going to set up an 404.html. And not found. Okay. And I'm also going to set up a redirect that's a catch-all. So how you do a catch-all redirect is you just literally hit a star and you direct people to the 404. So if you imagine in a single page app, you might want to send people to index.html, because then the single page app might redirect people to the right area. But here we're going to send people to the 404. So now when I refresh, it actually redirects to 404 on literally any URL, except for about us, which still works. So the redirects only run when there's no corresponding HTML or other static asset to use. For people using JavaScript and requesting JSON files, do note that sometimes you may accidentally hit a redirect and get back HTML when you actually meant to request something in JSON. So just be careful about that, and be aware that you're parsing HTML as JSON, and those will typically solve your errors. Now, of course, when you're getting your site up to production, you're probably also going to want to use a custom domain. So let's head over to Settings, head to the Domain Management section, and here's where you can configure your custom domains. Netlify offers free custom domains. That doesn't mean it buys the domain for you. But if you already have a domain bought somewhere, for example, from Google Domains or Hover, you can actually set it up to link that site together. This is something that other hosting providers charge for. So for example, I can just say whatever, Swyx.io, that's my own site. And I can click verify, and if it's already owned by me, I can say yes, add domain. Let's see what happened. So my site already currently uses this. If it's a site that hasn't been set up, you can also set that. If you have a domain that you want to buy, you can actually buy it through Netlify. And you can actually buy it through Netlify, and Netlify will buy it for you, and you can pay Netlify with that and to set it up for you. Here's what it looks like for my personal domain. I have a Netlify subdomain as well as a custom domain set up that's set to be the primary domain, and everything just redirects to that primary domain. I also have Netlify Managed DNS, and that's what Netlify uses. And that's an extra service that Netlify provides to add extra features. But anyway, so here's how the DNS panel looks if you have a custom domain set up. You can also enable IPv6, as well as customize your DNS records and name servers. Note that you can manage all your domains on this team level on app.netlify.com/teams/your-team/DNS. So that's the end of the first part of this video. Let's have a quick recap of what's available to you with Netlify when you're deploying. There are 4 methods of deploying. We started out with Netlify's historical method, which is dragging and dropping. Then we used the CLI to do a manual deploy. Then we also linked our repo up to GitHub. Then we set up continuous deploy from GitHub so that every time you push to GitHub, you'll get a new deploy, and that is continuous deployment. And finally, we set up the deploy to Netlify button on our README so that open source project can clone our repo and deploy in one click. We also took a little look at the defaults that are provided out of the box for Netlify. We get free HTTPS, also called SSL. We also get free deploy previews, same deal. You can also get branch deploys, which I do not cover in this video, but they're kind of the same thing, just for different branches. We also talk about Netlify as a CDN, how they're distributed among various points of presence, how Netlify deploys are atomic, meaning they all deploy every single file to production at once, and as well as providing instant rollbacks from a network control angle. We also talked a little bit about turning on asset optimization. So this is not on by default, but it's pretty much one click. And unless you have some bugs that are not compatible with this, you should always have it on. Then finally, we talked about Netlify and custom domains. So most things are hosted on a custom Netlify subdomain, but sometimes you want to do redirects around what the internal URL structure of your pages are. We covered that, as well as how to do catch-alls for 404s. We also covered how to link up custom domains, as well as a little bit about Netlify DNS and how Netlify can manage a DNS for you if you choose to have it. You can also set up branch deploys for managed DNS if you're using Netlify DNS. So that's the scope of deploying on Netlify. And in other videos, we'll cover the other sections. But if you have any questions about deploying, please let me know. Cheers. In this video, we're going to be covering part 2 of our series on Netlify, and specifically focusing on things that you should know about building and the continuous deployment aspect of Netlify. So let's drill into that a little bit more. We're going to cover build tools and static site generators. We'll cover what build settings are, what the build bot is, build stages, the different things that are done during the build, what concurrent builds are and how you can cancel builds to keep under your concurrent limit, some build gotchas that people commonly run into, as well as what to do when things go wrong. We'll end with a discussion about environment variables and the things that you can do to set them in Netlify to change the deployment environment to exactly what you need. First, let's have a little discussion about Netlify and build tools. Netlify is strongly supportive of build tools. In fact, one of the founding theses of Netlify is that static site generators are the next big thing. And that basically came from tracking the statistics on static site generators and seeing that people wanted to use them to deploy to our CDN, but they were manually doing it, and we wanted to build in a continuous deployment tool to help them build and deploy their sites. In fact, I strongly recommend watching this talk by Netlify CEO Matt Billman because it really explains the benefits of the Jamstack compared to what came before it. But anyway, we're here to learn about the build process. So the first thing to understand about the build process is that you can always do local builds. You may not need continuous deployment. The problem with continuous deployment is that it's done remotely, it's on someone else's server, and it may introduce extra hurdles for you when you're actually trying to just develop a new feature. So if you're doing local development, don't use continuous deployment. Just locally build and push stuff to Netlify until you're happy that you can turn continuous deployment back on. Let's take our existing site that we've been working on from part 1, and let's add a build process to it. So right now I have this folder, which is a dist folder, and it's got a bunch of index.html files And let's say I want to add some JavaScript to it to write some interactive components. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add the parcel bundler. So that would be yarn. First, I have to initialize the package.json. And then I have to add the parcel bundler. And while that's going on, I can also install React DOM because I'm going to use that as well. So here we're not using a static site generator, but we're using a build process, and the static site generator is just a massive build process. So now we've got the dependencies installed. We're going to rearrange this a little bit. So I'm going to take this dist folder and rename it to source. And we're going to build from the source to the dist folder. And remember that the folder that we ultimately publish is the dist folder. All right, the next thing I'm going to try and do is I'm going to go to this source folder. I'm going to add a new folder called index.js, for example. I'm going to paste in some pre-prepared React code. And I'm going to go to index.html and add a script that id equals app. And then I'm going to add a script tag at the bottom saying script source. So now when I run yarn parcel source index.html, I get a nice local server where I can see the results of my code. It says hello from React, and I can actually click an interactive button. So I know that I've added some JavaScript to my static site. So this is wonderful news, and we need to actually make this run in production. So I'm going to cancel my running process. I'm going to go over to package.json and make life a little bit easier for me with some npm scripts. This is obviously optional, but it's pretty common to set this up because it's easy to run. So I'm going to put in my command again, source index.html, and I'm going to introduce a build command as well. So this just has a build command. Again, you can use any process. You don't even have to use a JavaScript build tool, but this is just an illustrative idea to bring you through the thought process. So now when I run yarn build, it's going to execute this command and run parcel build, and that builds to the dist folder. And remember that dist folder is exactly what we're going to ship to Netlify. To verify that the dist folder has built successfully, I can use serve dist. Serve is a CLI that you can install, and that serves your files locally. And you can see that your code is running in production. The difference between this old version and this one is that this is running React in development mode, and over here we're running React in production mode. So that's how you can tell that your builds are running locally. So as long as you can develop and build locally, you may not need continuous deployment, because as long as you're debugging things and making sure that your JavaScript code is even valid, this is a perfectly fine way, and you don't have to use Netlify at all. But what Netlify does for you is starts to do that automation step. So basically, the idea is that you would not be checking in your dist folder. You would just be adding that to gitignore, actually. And you'd only have the source folder in your code. Let's see what happens when we push our latest changes to Git. We can see that our build has failed because this time we don't have a dist directory anymore. Remember, we added that to gitignore because we're now building from a source directory. That means that we need to run the build command in our deployment environment to set up continuous deployment. So that brings us to build settings. Really, there's only two places to set your build command. The first is in your deploy settings. So let's edit our settings over here and add the build command yarn run build. And we're still going to deploy from dist. And we'll save that. You can use the base directory if you have a subfolder, for example, if you have a monorepo setup. So now we have the build command set. We're going to have to go back to deploys and rerun the deploy again. You can see that our build is now successful. And in particular, you can see that we're now executing the user command yarn run build, which is the one that we did. And it's showing us running the build, showing the output of the build, and then saving a bunch of dependencies, and then deploying site from dist. So over here, if you want to check out the deploy, you can open this in a new tab and check out how this React code is now in production on the production Netlify site, and it's using the production build of React. So that's all well and good, but there's a second way to set the build command, and that's in netlify.toml. This is a higher priority command, so it actually overrides what we had before. So I'm going to comment it out, and this is how it should look. Under the build settings, you should add a command equals, and then whatever string you want to run yarn build. So this can take any form. Previously, we set yarn run build, but if you're using yarn, you can also just type yarn build, and that is basically the same command. I just want to show you some visual difference. I'm going to commit it to git, add build command, and I'm going to push it to master. And that'll kick off the build again in Netlify. Notice that this time, there's a special message printed over here saying there's a different build command detected, going to use the one specified in the toml file, yarn build versus yarn run build. So yarn run build is the first command that we set in the user interface, and yarn build is the second command that we actually set in netlify.toml. So this is higher precedence because that's the single source of truth for all the Netlify settings that you ever want to build. So I personally encourage people to use netlify.toml, but you may find it easier to onboard beginners with the web UI. Either way, when you read your logs, you should be able to figure out what's going on by keeping an eye out for the commands that you want to run and looking for any error messages in case. So overall, that's a very gentle introduction to build settings. It wasn't too hard. But really, what's at operation over here is the core of Netlify, which is the build bot. And that's something that we're going to dive into a little bit in this next section. So one way to find out about the build bot is to read some of these documentation on the site. It goes into a little bit about the origin of the build bot, some default environment settings and versions that you may want to know about. But basically, the high-level concept that you should know is that the build bot is basically a Docker container. Our CTO used to work at Docker, and so we're very familiar with this technology. And it gives us a lot of nice security and reproduction capabilities that is very helpful in creating a continuous deployment service like Netlify. So let's check out what the Docker container environment looks like. It really is just a massive bash file. This is entirely open source, so you can actually run it locally, so you can debug your own Docker builds. There's different versions of the build images that are available. So the legacy sites will have the trusty version. You should not run into that if you're watching this video. And the current sites have the Xenio build image, and that's the more current up-to-date version. You can see the branches accordingly. There is ongoing work on a new version of the build bot. So by the time you watch this video, there may be a new version available, but hopefully I'll also have a new video out by then covering that. But basically, you should be aware of that you can actually pull down the exact same Docker image that Netlify runs to your local environment so that you can test your builds in case something is going wrong in this whole build logic. And it's also open source, so you're welcome to contribute. But again, I want to stick to the high level. If you know that there's a build bot, you know that you can reproduce it, you know that it does a number of different things, but at a high level, you should be aware that there is a cache. So Netlify builds are not entirely stateless. We actually cache things for performance improvements. Everything is stored in a Netlify cache directory, and in fact, you personally can use a build script to save things in cache, diff them, and decide whether to build things or not based on the cache. You may write your own scripts, or you can use open source tooling like this one from David Wells called Cache Me Outside, which is pretty clever. I do like the name a lot, but basically it helps you to think about checking where do you store things in cache, how should you handle a cache update, and then checking for diffs between updates. And if there is a need to update the cache, then you run the cache update again. So a simple thing like that can actually cut down your build times by a lot by skipping the steps of building things that are unnecessary for you to build. Then it will install, then the build bot goes to the second stage. It starts installing dependencies. The dependencies here are not just your pack npm dependencies, but also your node versions. It will check the .nvm versions, for example. It will check your Ruby environments if you're using a Ruby static site generator like Jekyll, PHP, Hugo, so on and so forth. It even has Python, Go, a nice grab bag of everything that you could possibly want. I even have had some success installing Haskell. You can just curl your various environments and store them in cache. Basically anything that you can do in a typical bash environment, you can do in Netlify. Then we get to the actual build process. That's where we run your build command, if you have one. Obviously, we did the first part of the video entirely without a build process, so you don't have to have one if you don't need it. Then we package and optimize. This is an optimization step that may or may not apply for you, but basically this is post-processing and other optimizations that we do for delivering to our CDN. Then we're going to deploy the site from the dist folder. Again, this is from the folder that you specified in your netlify.toml or somewhere else. We're going to save the dependencies for the next build, and we're going to output a manifest. You can't see over here, but there's a manifest of what has been produced so that we can do diffs and so that we can produce images, so that we can produce summary information like this, showing you what files and what redirect rules have changed and have been processed by the build bot. So that's the high level overview of the build stages. Things happen in a sequence, and I think if you know where your issues are, if you're debugging a build, it will help you, it will help us a lot in helping you, and all around demystify Netlify by a lot. So the last thing that we should cover before getting into the gotcha section is concurrent builds and canceling builds. So the idea here is that anything can trigger a build, right? I can be pushing a commit to Git, or I could be triggering a deploy over here, or I could be triggering a deploy from a build hook that we talked about in the previous video. So over here, I have a build hook that I can just be calling randomly. And so now I have two concurrent deploys. So what's happening right here is that I only have a maximum of one concurrent deploy. So this is building and this is waiting. Sometimes I actually want to just skip this step because I just want to go straight to the most recent build because I know that's the one. And so I can just click in here and cancel the deploy. So once I cancel the deploy, I'm no longer using that concurrent deploy, and now I have the next one in queued. So I just have to wait a little bit, but already it's starting to build. So that's the rough idea. If you want to have for a single person workflow, one concurrent build is probably enough, but you may want, for a team, you may want to look into multiple concurrent builds so that you don't hold each other up. Canceling the build is as simple as just killing the Docker process. And that's all it is. So as long as everything is failing, every single build is failing, the most recent successful build actually still keeps alive. So your site doesn't go down until we have a new successful build. All right, so time to cover some gotchas that people typically run into. In fact, this is probably the most difficult part of learning Netlify, which is learning how to use a continuous deployment environment. In fact, we have a whole place in the docs dedicated to build gotchas. So if you have any issues, just make sure to have a read of all of these and see if that matches your situation. So some of the common gotchas that I wanted to highlight is, first of all, the 15-minute rule. Basically, if your build takes longer than 15 minutes, Netlify might cut it off on the free tier. If you're a customer or you have some sort of special case, you may get in touch with support to extend it up to 60 minutes or higher. Next, you also have to think about permissions and API secrets. Sometimes your builds, particularly if you're using a Gatsby or Nuxt template that requires a API key, otherwise it will fail to build, then you may need to provide those API keys in order to build stuff. We'll have a section at the end about environment variables and where you can set them. Lastly, I also want you to be careful about what folder you're deploying. So make sure that when you have a dist folder, you're actually building to the dist folder. Sometimes people just aren't aware of what folder they're deploying to, and just thinking that through can help a lot. And of course, there's a community Netlify topic where you can find out a lot more about FAQs that people run into on building things. So that really leads me into the troubleshooting part of the video, basically what to do when things go wrong. Make sure to read your build logs. I've already read the build logs with you for a number of different build situations. Make sure that you can build locally. So if all else fails, at least make sure you can do your build command locally, like yarn build, for example, and make sure that runs without any hiccups so that this exact same thing can actually run in Netlify. And then also think about hidden dependencies. So for example, over here I'm using node 10.13, and over in Netlify I'm using 10.16. If there's any differences that I'm relying on, that might actually cause some very subtle bugs. So just to be aware of that. You can set the node versions in an NVM script, and it's all well documented in the docs. Next, a yarn versus npm issue. So for example, one of the very common issues is relying on yarn in your build command, but then not having yarn in your build environment. And yarn is only installed if you have a yarn lock file. So if I delete this, this will just assume it's an npm setup, and the yarn command will not be available. So you need to add a yarn lock file for the yarn CLI to be installed. And that's just a pretty common issue for beginners. Basically, just always commit your lock files. If you're using Hugo, Grunt, Bower, or any other environment like Ruby or Python, definitely head to the build settings page to check out options for configuring the versions of your environment so that you can run the version that you actually expect. And if all else fails, definitely check out community.netlify.com, where you can probably search your question to be answered or just file your own question. The last part of this video focuses on environment variables, where you can set API secrets and all other good stuff. So basically, the only place to set environment variables as of right now is inside the user interface. So let's head over to our site. Go to Deploy Settings, scroll all the way down to Environment, and set environment variables. My secret, for example, I'm always agree. I'm going to save that, and now I can access this environment variable inside my build process. So I'm going to go in here and actually try to add that to my build process. One way I can do that is to just add it as a build command, as a pre-build. So over here, I can just add pre-build. And by the way, this is a built-in feature of npm scripts, nothing Netlify specific here. And let's commit this. So now if we open up our Netlify log again, you can now see that inside our new build, we're running the pre-build script, and it echoes the secret that I've placed inside of my environment variables. So this is handy for open source projects that may want to ping a private API, for example, to get some data to actually pass into the static site generator so you can build, for example, a Shopify site or Airtable data or anything else like that. Netlify environment variables are not just for passing in secrets to your app. You can also use them to change the environment, to vary the environment. So you can check out this list where these are Netlify specific environment variables, Netlify communicating to you. So you can check, for example, process.env.netlify, and if that's true, then you're inside of a Netlify environment. Netlify also tells you what immutable URL you're deploying to, the main URL that you're probably going to access, what branch is coming from if you're deploying from a different branch, the commit, the build ID, the context, basically a lot of metadata to figure out what the origin and meta information about your build is. So that's the first category of environment variables, which are things that Netlify puts in your environment to communicate to you what is going on in your environment. And the next category are things that you can set inside of Netlify's environment. So that changes the versions. For example, you can set the NPM version, you can set the Yarn version, or your Ruby version, or your Go version, your Java version, Python version, and all that stuff. And so this is extremely variable, and it's all there for you if you need it. There are also another category of environment variables that you should probably never touch, but these are helpful in case you need them for some debugging or some magic internal advanced things I personally never use. So if you want to learn more, check out this Scotch article that I wrote detailing how to use environment variables to pass secrets to the front end. Take note that exposing API tokens to your front end is sometimes a bad thing. So React, Vue, Gatsby, they all like to make you prefix your environment variables to make sure that you're aware not to leak everything over. And then a simple guide as to how to change environment variables to vary your environment, like we already explained, as well as some other power user features that we talked briefly about. Yeah, so that's an overall guide to Netlify build. In aggregate, it's not too complex, but when you combine building with deploying to Netlify Edge, that can be extremely powerful. And in the next video, we'll cover local dev and what Netlify can do for you there. See ya.
We're in part 3 of our introduction to Netlify, and this is Netlify Dev. Netlify Dev is the newest kid on the block, and in fact, most of it is still in beta, but it's worth talking about because it's kind of the newest functionality, and it helps a lot with your local dev capabilities. So the best way to find out more information about it is to check out the site, netlify.com/product/dev, and this gives you a good overview about what it does. It's a dev server that powers a lot of the local replication of what the Netlify production platform is, and we just replicate it on your local environment. And the reason you want this is because, remember, you want to have faster iteration cycles and you don't want to wait for the build bot. So you want to have full control and local replication of your builds before you actually deploy them. So the way you get there is to npm install the CLI and then run Netlify Dev. And this has the detector mode that will pick up any of your static site generator projects. So that starts a full local environment. It detects and runs your site generator, makes environment variables available from the production platform, does edge logic so your redirects will work, and then runs your cloud functions as a function, as a local server. And we proxy everything together. And then you can also stream live as well. So the best way to get started is also to head to the docs. There's a talk that you should definitely check out introducing Netlify Dev. This talk happens to be the keynote at which Netlify Dev was launched, so definitely check that out. And the other thing you should know about the docs is that it's not the full story. The Netlify Dev API is still a little bit in flux, and so we've actually managed that on the CLI repo. And you have to just go to the GitHub, Netlify-/CLI, and you just look in the README and look for the Netlify Dev docs. And here you can get actually detailed information about usage. But we're going to guide you through it. So let's head over to our demo site that we've been working on. And this is running Parcel, and it's a project that we can run. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat this as a static site. So I'm going to act as the build bot. And what does the build bot do for building this site? It doesn't run the dev server, it actually runs the build command, right? So let's actually just run the build command ourselves. I'm going to run yarn build, and that actually runs parcel build, and that generates to the dist folder you can see over here. And so that's normally what we'd serve from Netlify's point of view. And so now we can actually run Netlify Dev. So we have that CLI command, Netlify Dev. There's that little gem icon that I'm very proud of. And you can see that there's no dev server detected. It's spun up a server on localhost 3999 as well as a Netlify Dev server on localhost 8888. So they're two different servers, and let's see what the difference is. So now I'm on localhost 8888, and you can see that I have an active React app. It looks good, and that's what we've been working with. But also I can go to localhost 3999 and get the exact same thing. So I also have a live React app. And so what's the difference? Why do we have two different servers? And that's what you really have to understand about Netlify, is that there's a project server and then there's a Netlify Dev server. So the project server is, if it comes with a server, then we'll use that one. If not, Netlify Dev will spin up a server for you and then serve from there. So that's what we've been doing just now, which we serve up a static host. And it will join everything and then output a single unified location, so localhost 8888. So that about sums it up for the build process. But we also want to preserve the developer experience of the live hot reloading dev server. So let's take a look at what parcel does for hot reloading. We run yarn start, and it runs parcel source index HTML, and then it outputs at localhost 1234. So that's the important port for them. For parcel, it's going to be 1234. For other projects that create React app, it will be others. But we know that for Netlify Dev, so we can go into netlify.toml and add that config command. So the port will be 1234. And we can tell Netlify Dev that. And you can see documentation for this in the Netlify Dev docs over there. And that's exactly what we're doing. And then we'll add the command of yarn start. That's exactly what we just did, right? We ran yarn start and then we navigated to localhost 1234. So we've configured Netlify Dev inside of netlify.toml. And the final piece is that we'll want to add a publish directory. This is really where the redirects file will be located. It's not strictly necessary, but it's probably a good idea to leave it in there. I'm just going to point it to source. Doesn't really matter. So now I can run Netlify Dev. And instead of running a static server for me, it's going to actually start to run the parcel server for me on localhost 1234. I'm making an emphasis on this because previously we ran a static server and we just did yarn build before running our static server and then serving up our files locally. Now we're using Netlify Dev to run parcel start or yarn start, which runs parcel, and parcel runs a server at localhost 1234. So again, you'll see that the site can be accessed on localhost 1234. And also the Netlify Dev server can be accessed at localhost 8888. So the question then becomes, why bother to have two servers? It's confusing. It seems like it's unnecessary. We have localhost on 8888 as well as 1234. And the reason is because of this diagram. And this is all the extra functionality we get to add because we're proxying the project's original server to 8888. And so when we're the user, we actually view that URL, localhost 888, and we get all this functionality that we would get in production. For example, redirects. So over here in my underscore redirects file, I have a redirect from about us to about. And so when I head to localhost 8888, I can type in about us, and that redirects to /about. And that means that our redirects are working locally. And that's important for people, for example, in the advertising industry who really care a lot about broken links. I also want to show you how detectors work. So notice I'm starting from an empty folder and I'm going to create a new Create React app. That's always very awkward to say. And now when I'm done installing, notice how this is a normal Create React app folder. And normally you'd start by typing yarn start, and that kicks off the React script's start script. But here we're actually going to just run Netlify Dev, and Netlify Dev is going to pick it up, the fact that we're running a Create React app project, and then it'll just run automatically and pick it up. So that's the vision of Create React app and detectors and Netlify, that Netlify Dev will just detect your project and it will just run the server automatically without any configuration. Now we're going to do a quick demo of how environment variables work in Netlify Dev, and you can pull down your production environment variables to local dev. Obviously, you shouldn't always do that, but it can be very helpful for debugging and not duplicating some environment variables. So first I'm going to run a yarn build, And because I don't have this new project linked up to Netlify, I'm going to run Netlify init. And because I don't have it linked to GitHub, I'm just going to choose the create deploy site manually option. And it's just going to create a site instance for me that I can deploy to. So now I'm just going to create a netlify.toml file. And that's going to house all the settings which I normally would set up. So first I'll add in a build key with a publish value of build. And the other command I'm going to run is just netlify deploy -- prod. And so now, because I'm just going to publish that build folder, that's all I need to know. And now I'm deployed. My create React app is deployed without continuous deployment. But now I can run something like netlify open and head to the deploy section and head to the environment variable section and add in an environment variable. Here I'm using everybody's favorite environment variable, my_secret, but that's actually not going to work in a React app because create React app doesn't want you to expose every environment variable on the front end. So they have this filtered. You must prefix all your environment variables with React app _ and then whatever your environment variable is. So those are the ones that will actually get exposed on the front end. And that's a very good security feature, but it just trips up people who don't know that it exists and they have to look in the docs. So now we can actually reference that environment variable inside of our code. So here I'm just going to access process.env.react app my secret. And that's going to be available in production. So typically what you do here is you try to have a duplicate .env file locally and then run that. But here when I run Netlify Dev, I just run nd because of my shortcut. I can just run the dev server, but then also if you look at the build logs, it also injects this build setting of environment variables. So Netlify Dev goes up into my Netlify instance, pulls down that secret, and now locally, I haven't deployed yet. Locally, I have access to that production environment variable. So that's the idea, and that can be extended to do a lot of different things, to get, for example, integrations with add-on providers. I'm going to do a video on that as well. But just trivially, you can replicate your production environment with environment variables and redirects. You can also share them live with Netlify -live, but that's very beta, so I'm not going to show it to you today. And the other thing that we're going to talk about is also not exposing your secret. So here I have a secret that I want to work with, but I don't want to expose it to the front end, but I still have to work with it in some form. So for example, like an API secret that I want to hide somewhere, right? Like I don't want the user to know it because then they can also just use my functions. So I'm going to show you the Netlify functions create command. You can type it out as part of the CLI. So obviously we're just going to use Netlify functions :create. But obviously you can also use a alias for that. I use NFC and that just runs that command. I don't have a functions folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to netlify.toml and add a functions folder. You can call it the very creative name of functions, but you can just really call it whatever you like. And now I'm going to run Netlify functions create again. And notice it created that functions folder. And now it gives me this drop down of things I can choose from. So there's a whole bunch of pre-made templates for you to get started, depending on your use case. Here, we're really just going to go through and maybe pick something like this hello world function that I've picked out. And that really scaffolds out that template into your functions folder that you've configured. By default, Netlify Dev gives you a folder and then a script under that folder, which is named the same. And it follows the AWS Lambda syntax. And so now I can rename my secret to just my secret because I'm not going to expose it to the front end. And I can take that my_secret and expose and grab it in process.env inside of my Netlify function. So here I have it co-located with my source code, but I'm just going to say process.env.mySecret. And I'm just going to echo it out in a JSON body response. So now I'm going to run Netlify Dev, and that, again, thinking about your mental model, runs that create React app server, but then also runs a Netlify function server. So it's under the URL .netlify/function/hello-world. And now that response, hello, I'm always angry, that's the exact response from the environment variables. So we've now shown you how to access environment variables from the front end as well as via functions. And that's very helpful. So for example, when I create a hook, or I fetch data when I load my app. And when I load my app, I can just head back to the front end. That's going to ping my function. And let me just open up the DevTools over here. So I'm going to open my app, and it's going to ping my function. And so it's not going to expose that environment variable on the front end. It's going to just ping that Netlify function, and the function itself has access to that environment variable. Now, obviously, this is a very simple function. And if you look at the code, it's actually, we've erred on the side of very simplicity, just to show you that you really don't need that much to get going. We've even included some boilerplate like catching and returning a status code of 500 if there's an error. And that's just a best practice for HTTP status codes. But here we're going to introduce a more complicated function. And this time, one that uses node modules dependency for itself. So again, we're going to run Netlify functions create. I'm going to pick the node fetch template. And node fetch itself installs node modules with a package JSON, and then it uses that as a fetch inside of node to ping an API. So this is a more realistic Netlify function or serverless function, which proxies an API for you. So here I'm going to ping the node fetch in my front end, and then run Netlify Dev. And now when I reload my front end, it actually loads that external API. And so now it's proxied so that I can bypass CORS issues, for example, or I can add a secret API key, or I can add several functions, or I can read a database, and really just whatever you want to do in Node, you can do in Node.js functions subject to the timeout limits. So here, for example, I can add my process.env.mySecret, and if that was required by the API, I could definitely send it in there without exposing it to my front end. So that is probably the number one support question, and now you know how to do that. I can also swap it out. So for example, here I have a different API, and I'm swapping it out for Chuck Norris jokes. Always a good time. But hopefully you get the idea that I'm developing all this very, very quickly inside of my local dev environment. And it's exactly the same environment as it would be in a serverless scenario. I can even test it. For example, if I open up a new terminal and type Netlify functions invoke, that will give me a list of my existing functions, and I can pick that one of the functions like hello world. I can choose whether I want to emulate Netlify identity. We'll talk about this in another video. I'm going to go with no for now. And that would basically pass a authentication header if I need to. But here we get the mock response. So without even running a front end, I can test my Netlify function. And so that's a very good example. For more information, definitely read the README. For example, for passing a sample payload, query string, as well as a file that has that payload. We do have special case event-triggered functions. We're not really going to cover that right now, but event-triggered functions are basically hard-coded names that are triggered on certain events, like, for example, when someone signs in through Netlify Identity, and that's useful to know. Now, an important thing to know is to understand what happens when I have my Netlify functions continuously deployed. So, for example, here in my gitignore folder file, I have the node modules gitignored. So that means that when I deploy my files in Netlify's buildbot, the node modules for the node fetch function will not be there. And that will be a problem because it will try to require the node fetch module, and it will fail. So here I have an example of such a failure. And it says, for example, error could not find node fetch module in the file. And so a lot of people run into this and think it's a bug with Netlify Dev. It's not really. It's also a little bit our fault that we can make this experience a bit nicer. But really, the solution is to make sure to install, to run npm install or yarn on each individual function folder if you need it. Obviously, if you don't need it, you can just put everything in the top level node modules, and that's the standard node resolution algorithm. But one solution to actually use is to add Netlify Lambda. So this is a helper library. It used to be the predecessor to Netlify Dev, and that's why you see some old information about this. But now Netlify Lambda is a helper library for Netlify Dev, and we'll use the Netlify Lambda install thing, and we'll just add it as a post-install npm script. So now that will run, and it'll go through every single function folder, and it will just install the dependencies for every functions folder. And you can read more in the docs, but essentially this is what the success will look like. We can see somewhere in the docs that we'll have a Netlify Lambda install command being run, and it will say it's installing function dependencies and node fetch dependencies are installed. So that's the kind of thing that we are looking for a continuously deployed serverless Netlify function solution with node dependencies, all independently managed per folder. And that's a really good way to handle the dependencies, because it will just guarantee that it's always installed. And so here you can see the same app that we built in dev in production, and it was working exactly the same. Now, if you notice, all of these functions that we've been written so far is in Node.js format with the exports.handler syntax or module.export syntax. And if you want to use Webpack, Babel, or TypeScript, you can't really do that here without a build step, right? This is raw Node.js. It runs under Node 8 or 10. And you really need a build step, and that's where you use Netlify Lambda. So Netlify Lambda and Netlify Dev have similar but overlapping responsibilities, and I wrote a lot of docs in the README to explain how to use them. But basically, Netlify Lambda is a build tool now that runs your Netlify functions from a source to a dist. And that's the basic understanding that you have to achieve here. Now these functions will be your source file, and you're going to have to serve or publish the functions from a dist folder. So here we can actually move everything. So for example, I can create a new function folder called source/functions, and I can move this function, this hello world function, to a TypeScript function. I can also just like rename everything. So I'm gonna add some TypeScript types. So for example, I can follow the docs and add Babel preset TypeScript, yarn add -d Babel preset TypeScript, and I can also add a bunch of other utilities like TypeScript, types node, and types AWS Lambda. And that just helps to add TypeScript to my project. Here I'm only going to use it for that hello world function, but you can see everything I'm about to do. So I'm adding a Babel RC file, and so we're using TypeScript with Babel. And now in hello world.ts, I can import the types for importing the handler, context, callback, and API gateway type from AWS Lambda. So now I can go through and type everything. And I can also use the export keyword, and that's a very, very handy way of typing everything. So now I can type, for example, API gateway events for event, and context for context. And now each of these things have the correct properties on them. So for example, if I type event dot, it gives me all those values from the autocomplete because of the types that are just from definitely typed of AWS Lambda. Same thing for context. Including an identity field, which we can use for Netlify identity. And so these are just very handy ways of writing better, more correct code if you are okay with using a build step and using TypeScript. And so now we need to impose a build command. I'm going to put it on the post-build part of NPM scripts. It's going to run Netlify Lambda build source functions. So it's going to build from the source functions into the production, publish the folder that we're going to publish, like functions hello world. And that's going to be hello world.js, right? And that's going to be a minified output from the source TypeScript file. And so that's what Netlify Lambda does. It helps you install dependencies, and it helps you build from a source file to a dist file. And so then everything can be run locally. Netlify Dev has an understanding of what Netlify Lambda is, so it will run Netlify Lambda build for you if it detects it in your package scripts. So this is what we call function builder detectors, and that's exactly how it's supposed to work. So that you can run it locally and make sure that your scripts are up to date, but then also deploy them with minimum configuration. So that is Netlify Dev. We're going to go to the next part to identity, forms, analytics, CMS, all that good stuff. But thank you for taking the time to check out Netlify Dev, and hopefully that helps your local dev work. Okay, so now we're on to forms. This is actually a pretty big section. It's one of the most widely used add-ons of Netlify, and it's meant for what it says on the tin, for form submissions. It's not a database, although it does store data. So don't try to use it as a database because it will cost you. And also, it's just not meant for that in terms of the data structure that it offers. But it's very handy for contact forms, like if you want to inquire about prices, or if you want to book a workshop or something, or leave a comment, or upload a file, for example, for claiming receipts or something like that. All of these are very good use cases for Netlify forms. So where to find out about Netlify forms? We're going to go over to the docs and head to the form section. And forms are literally adding an attribute onto a form tag. As far as regular HTML goes, I do think it's a little bit more complicated for React forms, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works in React. But in plain HTML, we can actually do this pretty easily in our demo that we've been working on. So I'm going to go over to the demo that we have. And I'm going to go over here. So right now, I have all this bunch of stuff. Actually, I'm just going to go over to the About. So let's put the forms on the About page. So you can see right now I don't have any forms. I just have a bunch of header and HTML. And then let's go over to the drop demo site. Let's see. Drop Netlify, drop demo site master. Yep. Okay. Let's go over to the forms and see that here the documentation. Here's some basic info, and there's nothing here because there's no forms activated. So what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to copy and paste this example down inside of the About Us page, and I'm going to say this is the Contact Us page because I just like to name things what they do. So I'm going to call this contact.html. And now because I have a build step from source to dist, I have to say yarn build, basically just following my own build command down in here. I covered this in the previous video. And I can now deploy. I like deploying locally and not using the continuous deployment when I'm debugging something like a form, so that I can do the builds locally and just be very, very sure what I'm building, because sometimes your static site generator might strip out some values. Here, we just really want to make sure that we have a Netlify tag. So if I refresh, I should be able to see something different. I should see the form name, contact, because I specified the Netlify tag, and I should see that it's got no submissions right now. So let's have a look at what it looks like on the current deployed site. I'm going to go over to the Contact Us page, and here I'm going to say, hello, freeCodeCamp. Obviously, you want to put validation on this before sending. Well, there we go. So by default, it sends us to this thank you page, which is just a default Netlify page. And you can customize that later. We'll just show you in a separate section. But you can see over here, if you head to the form section and you head here, that you see the form submission down in here as well. Let's go ahead and attach file submissions to this form. I'm going to just duplicate this and call this file. You must have an input type of file that's the semantic HTML, and then we can just call this whatever you want, like FCC file. And we'll save that. Again, I'm going to yarn build and push using my alias for Netlify deploy. So I just changed the form, but because it's the same name, it's going to still reflect as the same form over here. And it's still reflected that, but it's got a new field here for FCC file. So let's go over here and refresh it. Form 2, form at freeCodeCamp.org. Let's pick a file. Let's send a little image. Send that up there. Thank you, submitted. And when we refresh, we should be able to see form 2 and a link for the file that was submitted. So this is an image, but obviously it could be something else as well. Now this thank you page is kind of ugly, so let's actually change that to reflect something that reflects the look and feel of our site. And we'll head over to the project. We'll copy over this contact HTML and we'll say thank you .html. Blah, blah, blah. Thank you. Thank you. And take that out. All right. Also going to want to link to that somewhere or build that somewhere. So I will just refer to that in index.html. And then the other step, not to forget, is to add an action to the form. So I'm going to add an action and I'm going to say, just head to the thank you page after you're done submitting. Okay, so I think that's ready. I'm going to yarn build. Again, I'm doing manual deployments because I don't want to wait for continuous deployments. I want full control over everything, so do not continuous deploy. All right, so I'm going to refresh and I'm going to say try 3, potato, tomato, whatever. And I'm going to choose the jam reptiles image. I'm going to send that in. It's going to submit and it's going to redirect and say thank you, right? Or you could redirect to the index page or whatever. So over here, I received the submission again. Okay, so that's all well and good. And now we have a basic working flow. The next thing you're going to want to do is probably to do something else on submission. So right now, when you're submitting your forms, you don't really know about them. They're just there and you have to kind of check for them. You can actually opt to get an email when people submit forms to you. You can add notification, you can add Slack integrations, an email, or outgoing webhook to anything that is listening for a webhook. So that's an option as well. I should probably put that in there as one of the options. But then what I wanted to make clear is that you can also create functions that do whatever you want, including form validation. So everything here is client-side. But what if you need to do server-side form validation? Do you need a server? Obviously, the answer is no, because we're Netlify. And here's how to do it. We're going to declare a function folder down in here. I'll just call the functions folder the very imaginative name of functions. And we'll put that in, we'll create that functions folder. I actually have a Netlify Dev alias for this, or template for this. So I'm going to use Netlify functions create, and I'm going to look for the submissions created template. So I'm going to let Netlify Dev scaffold that out for me. So what this does, submission created, is it runs when a submission is being done, and it parses that email and it sends stuff out. We're going to dramatically simplify this so that we can actually just try doing something with our event triggered function, because this is what it's called. This is a special name in the docs where it just fires when people submit forms. So we're going to parse the event body and payload. We're going to console log it out. And it's going to be JSON and stringify this thing. And then we're just going to return a body that reflects some measure of success. I am going to just return something like a status code 200. And actually, I'm just going to say, OK. All right, so very, very simple function, a few lines of code, and we're just logging out what we receive, and we'll see what happens there. Okay, so now we can just Netlify deploy again. Notice I don't have to build the front end because all I'm doing is working with the functions. So now it's discovered the function and it's deploying the function as well. If you want to see the function over here, you can actually head to the function section and refresh. And you can see that there's a submission created function and there's a log for this function. So now we're going to submit another form, try number 4, same potato. We're going to submit it again, but now it's going to fire. And it might take a while, but we will actually see the logs here. So the idea is that everything that was submitted, you can actually access, including some nice metadata that you can use, and send it off to whatever other service that you're using. So here we've got a subscription newsletter thing, but this is literally as flexible as you want. You can obviously set up your own Slack integration or Twilio or whatever you can think of, just from the event of someone submitting a form for you. And obviously you still have the form data over here. So now that anyone can send in a form to your site, the immediate question is, how do we make sure that they're legit and not spam submissions? And that is the question of spam filtering. We're going to cover 3 methods. And the first one is the best because it takes no configuration. You already have it on by default. And that's Akismet filtering. And Akismet is what WordPress uses for managing anti-spam. They measure it against other ongoing spam activity and help you actively block them. It's hard to test them because it's kind of amorphous, but we can actually try with some of these hard-coded names which are guaranteed to be spam. And let's just try and submit them and see what happens. So we'll submit them over here, and when we refresh, we don't see them show up in the verified submissions because they're over in the spam submissions. And you can review them and either delete them or mark them as verified. And once they're verified, they'll show up. The next method we want to address is the honeypot. So the honeypot is a security method where basically tricking bots into filling out fields which humans would not see. And you can hide those fields with CSS. So we'll try this on this honeypot field over here. And here's how you're going to do it in the docs. But basically, if you go over to your contact form, and let's put in a honeypot field. I'm just going to copy and paste this field and paste it in there. And so the idea is that this will be hidden. And we can add in a style tag, for example, dot hidden, opacity 0. And then the last thing to do is to tell Netlify that this is a honeypot field. So anything with the name bot field is a honeypot field. So we'll just tell Netlify that. And okay. And so now we are in build again and Netlify deploy. So the idea is that you have extra spam prevention enabled by honeypot field. That's a new indication that it's on. And it's kind of hard to demo because it just works, but I'm going to try anyway. So let's actually just use the form. And here you can see the opacity 0 field. Obviously, you can move it around with CSS or shrink it or whatever. Doesn't really matter. But here, let's just say human at human, or I'm human, and human at human.com, and send that in. And we should see human at human.com show up over here. That's fantastic. And now let's actually say robot, and not totally human.com. And let's actually fill in that field we're not supposed to fill in. So the idea is that as a human, you never see this field, so you never fill it in. But as a robot, you're filling in fields indiscriminately. So I'm totally human. All right, so there's a field here. And we're going to send that in. And let's see the network tab. And we're going to send that in. And you can see in the post request that we sent that in the bot field, it's actually filled out. So that means that when Netlify receives it, they know that that field is supposed to be screened out. So it just doesn't even show up when you refresh. And that's one way of spam prevention via honeypot field. It doesn't even show up in the spam submissions just because we know for sure it's spam. Great. So that's the second method. And then the third method is reCAPTCHAs. So adding a reCAPTCHA is pretty much the same as adding a honeypot, except that it has a different method of catching spam. And this one imposes more work on humans, but has a higher chance of success of filtering out spam. So the way you do it is over here, if you scroll down to the reCAPTCHA section, and you literally add a reCAPTCHA field. So let's just add it in over here to our code. And we'll also tell the form that there is a reCAPTCHA field. So this is the most secure form there has ever been. We're going to build and deploy again. So when I refresh, there's a reCAPTCHA field. Obviously, it could be styled better, but you kind of fill it in. And let's intentionally fail the reCAPTCHA. It's just not letting me through. So yeah, I can't really fake being a robot. Oh no. So it's that good that even though I'm a human trying to simulate being a robot, I just have to be good enough at computer vision to let it through. And now it's through. And I can see my own submission. And yeah, so it is a little bit more annoying, but that's reCAPTCHA for you, and you're pretty much guaranteed that it's not a robot. And that's also V2, so you should know the difference between reCAPTCHA V2 and V3. V2 is the one with the annoying picking of stuff. There is reCAPTCHA of your own settings, so you can set up your own reCAPTCHA secrets. Over here, you're using Netlify's. And reCAPTCHA V3 is the new one without image selection. It's invisible and supposed to be low friction. And you'd have to set that up yourself with JavaScript. But if you're worried about user friction, this is the way to go. So we talked about spam filtering, and I just wanted to address one of the important nuances that a lot of developers face with modern JavaScript frameworks, and that's with single-page apps. And let's just talk a little bit about how we're doing the form processing here. So when you deploy, you can actually see that here I'm doing manual deploys, but it's the same principle. I deploy from my CLI or from GitHub, whatever. And once it builds and pushes all the HTML out, there's this post-processing step that happens. And that's where the forms are detected. What Netlify is basically doing is saying, okay, out of all of these generated files, let's zoom out a little bit. Out of all these generated files in the disk folder, which of these are HTML? And it looks like this one is HTML, okay? And let's look at all of these fields and look for a form field with the Netlify tag, right? And then I'm just going to scan this in as a form. The problem with this is that sometimes the form doesn't exist as a single page app. So sometimes you just have like div ID equals app, and that's all you ship for create React app. So that's a common problem, and there are a number of ways to do this. So what happens in this scenario where there's no form in the HTML is that Netlify would just tell you that it hasn't detected any forms, and therefore it doesn't set up the form for you on the back end. So you need to tell Netlify that there is a form. And so what the trick is to that is that instead of this div ID app, you can basically take the app form field name and put it inside of the div ID app, and then paste it in there. And so this way, Netlify will scan the HTML and find the form name, set up the fields, and then React will come in and replace everything inside of div ID app and use its own JavaScript created elements that look exactly the same as this thing. So because this is really important for people to understand, we're actually going to go through the actions and actually do this. And just to make really, really clear how this is done so that when you run into your own single page app scenario, I don't care what framework you're using, the same principles apply. It has to exist in the final HTML, and then you can do whatever you want on the JavaScript side of things. And we'll talk about some AJAX form submissions as well. So over here, remember in our initial video, we actually replaced index.html with some JavaScript, index.js over here. I'm going to take that out and move it over to the contact form. So the contact form is now going to have the JavaScript. And the JavaScript is going to look for an ID of app and say hello from React. So let's do that. And I'm going to say ID. Actually, no, let's put this here. Div ID equals app. And we'll do close the div here. Okay, so let's start this and let's see how that works. So this will be in the HTML, but React will come in and replace everything inside div ID app. So let's head to the form. And you can see that little flash of the form, but as the JavaScript came in, now it became a React app. So the whole idea is that I have to replicate what's in here with the React stuff. So there's one version of this in here in the HTML, and then the other one inside of the form. All the classes have to be class names. So there's the form now from React, right? And if you're a Gatsby or other static site generator user, you're going to be yelling at me saying you should probably just, instead of duplicating between HTML and JavaScript, right, having the same form in both, why not just statically generate from JavaScript? I'll tell you what, I agree with you. So let's install Gatsby and see how that works. So yarn add Gatsby. And we're going to just make a very simple Gatsby page. So we'll add pages and we'll say something like my Gatsby.js, Gatsby form.js, why not? So we'll render this and we'll export this by default. We'll see what happens when we add a new script like Gatsby build or build Gatsby. You can name it whatever you like. I'm just relying on convention. So now with Gatsby installed and I have the Gatsby page set up, it's going to ignore all this HTML stuff, which is fine for me. But I have the Gatsby page set up. Let's see what it builds for me. So I ran Gatsby build, and by default, Gatsby builds to the public folder, not the dist folder. And you can change that in the Gatsby config. It's up to you. But I wanted to make sure to go through this exercise because it's important to know that, yes, you save the duplicate action from just writing in JavaScript and then letting that generate your HTML so that Netlify can scan the HTML and set up your form for you. But you do need to know some caveats. So that's why I'm here. So in the public folder, this is all the generated stuff that you're going to deploy, right? And inside a Gatsby form, it's generated an index.html. And inside that index.html, we see what we expect to see, which is a full HTML thing with all the scripts and stuff. And that's great. And the form. So Netlify can read this. But it's missing one important thing, which is a very important attribute. And if you see over here, it says hello from React. And then, but it doesn't have the React code because that'll be hydrated later. And then it's got this form. It's got all the right fields except for one, which is going to cause you no amount of annoyance until you figure it out. So I'm here to save you that time, which is it's got the reCAPTCHA field, it's got the honeypot field, it's got the action field, but it doesn't have the Netlify field. It's right over here. And that's because Gatsby by default strips unrecognized fields. And that's why Netlify actually recognizes both the data dash version as well as the non-data dash version. And for Gatsby and for a lot of Webpack and like Create React App and other build tools, they wanna strip away stuff that isn't going to be used as far as they know in production. So they strip away the Netlify tag, So we need to make sure that that does show up. So I'm going to make sure I'm going to change this to data Netlify and make it true. So, and I'll save this as my Gatsby form in my React page, and I'll rerun my build. And now when you see the generated HTML, just make sure to check that the form does show up with the right tag. And then all will be happy. All right, so we're going to switch from Gatsby issues, Gatsby and other static site generator issues. Just remember that they might strip out some stuff. And we're going to switch back to the regular single page app code, because that will pretty much behave exactly the same in Gatsby or in a single page app thing like Create React App. And now let's take a look at this form and the subsequent action of redirecting to a thank you page. This may not be what we want in terms of user experience. Like, let's say we submit this form and it goes in. Notice that it redirects to a different page. Here, locally, it's redirecting to the home page instead of the thank you page, because that's all we serve. But that's still, the point remains that maybe you want to stay on the same page. So let's talk about that. So if that's what you want, then you're going to have to submit it through JavaScript instead of a default HTML form submission. So we're in our React app, and we're going to have to write some submit handlers to handle that submission. So it will be something like const handle submit. It takes an event, and we can call event.prevent default. And the form will have a target, and the form will be the target of the event. And so the whole idea is you prevent the default submission of the form via regular HTML, and then we handle everything in JavaScript and update the state accordingly. So, for example, I can have a message that updates like that. And I'll just make this nothing. And I'll display a message, something like message. If not, I'm going to show hello from React. And then I'll just paste in some fetch boilerplate. So basically, we have to replicate all the functionality that we would typically get, and as well as grab all the names of every input field and just submit those values. For this example that I copied, it's assuming controlled values, meaning that there is some state that you can just spread into the body. But here you can also do uncontrolled React components, and I'll assume that you already know how to do those. So I'm just going to fill in the rest of it by going form.name.value. So email value. Okay, so then we'll have we'll send the submission to the endpoint, and then on success we'll navigate. If assuming we have a router library, which we don't in this setup, but assuming you have a router library, we navigate by going to the attribute of the form, which is the action. And so that's a kind of cheap way to simulate that. But here we're assuming that we want to stay on this same page after submission. So we don't actually need this navigation, and we don't need the action field as well. So I'm going to remove that just to make clear that you don't need it. So I go down to the form. This is only for the regular HTML, like after submission navigation. So I'm going to delete that, and now I'll say something like set message success. And that should refresh accordingly. Before we forget, we should also I should also mention that this encode command is a nice little wrapper around the form data API inside of the browser. And you can also use this on the server if you want. Just look for the relevant npm package. And that just encodes things properly so that people know, so that Netlify knows it's a form. And then don't forget to wire up the submit handler. So that's all you need for firing up the React app. And so locally, we don't have the form endpoint at the back. So we can't really test it that much apart from just sending it in and then seeing that there's an error because it's a 404 when you post that message. But we can actually build and deploy. So when we go to the production site and try this out again, hello Ajax at potato.com, send it in. We can actually control the state of the form and stay on the same page and do everything within React. But in the back end, we can actually see the form submission come in. It says hello Ajax. So the next section is going to be about password protection and role-based access control. And this is a very, very broad-based CDN level protection for your content, for your site. And so let's look into what that looks like. So if you head into settings and you look into access control, you can see that this is available on paid plans. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer this over to a different team so that we can actually see what this paid plan looks like. And now when I head to access control, I can see this password and I can set a password. So a simple password like password. Oops. And that's a nice password over there. And what that looks like is simply a password control down in here. And so, especially for internal sites that you're building for your coworkers, you can just supply something like this, PASSWRD, and have password-based access control. We actually do this a lot inside of Netlify for private sites. And for more fine-tuned JWT-based access control, where you can have role-based access control, you can set the JWT secret. You can definitely check the docs for more of that information. But basically, this involves using a third-party authentication provider like Auth0 or Okta, and they can authenticate your JWT secrets. And you can say only admins are allowed to view this page, and you can set it in the redirects file. So you can limit it just to admins, and everyone else will get the 404. So that's how you do it with role-based access control. Definitely hit up our support if you need to enable this for your company. For everyone else, you can actually take advantage of the Netlify Identity service, which we're going to move on to next. Okay, so the difference between access control and identity is that access control is restricting access from the CDN level, and identity is for a typical login, logout situation on the client side. So let's go and enable identity, and that's a pretty simple operation. We're going to go over to the identity section and hit enable identity, and we're enabled. And that's pretty simple. And let's now figure out how to, let's just play around with identity a little bit. So the best way to play around with it is to head over to the Netlify Identity widget docs and actually go to the live demo. And let's just get a sense of what this does before actually using it. So here's a static page, and we've got a simple button here. We click it, and that gives us this widget that's a modal, and we can fill in some information, or we can sign up and log in. So let's just go through the sign up flow. Swyx 123, Swyx at +123 at. So that's going to send a confirmation message to my email. And I'm going to go to my email. And so in my email, I get this standard thing. This can be customized, but we're not going to go over that. And I'm just going to click customize or confirm my email address. And I'm logged in. And that redirects me back to the original page. Remember, I had this original page. So I can shut that instance down. And this is the one where I'm already automatically logged in. And when I click outside, you can see that in the root of the page, outside of the modal, I can access that information now. You can also see that information on the console. I think we log it out. And this is what's available to you inside of JavaScript. In particular, together with the JWT token with all your information and logins that you're going to use, but also with things that you sign up with, like your full name. There's also that's a single button where it's got sign up and log in on the same modal. But in some designs, you may wish to have multiple buttons with a sign up and log in on a different button. And that's really just up to you how you want to configure it. It's pretty configurable as well. So here it goes to sign up, and here it goes to log in. And that's a pretty handy modal. Obviously, this is entirely open source, so if you need to style it, you can actually customize the styles yourself. But you can just fork it as well. I'm also going to show you how we can authenticate with one of the social auth providers. I'm going to authenticate with Google. And it's got my email. Please don't spam me. But then also it's got some extra metadata from Google. For example, my avatar. So I could have rendered this and see my GitHub avatar. Okay, so that's the demo. We're gonna learn how to apply it onto our working widget thing. And for that, you should look at the docs. There is the script tag way, and then there's the npm way. So we'll check out the script tag way first. I'm not super keen on showing everything else because if you're a JavaScripter, you should be able to figure it out. But maybe you might be getting stuck on something, so that's why I'm here, right? So I'm gonna do this on my index.html page. All right, and I'll drop the script tag up here, and then add a div down in here as well. Oh, let's just do up top. Okay. So let's try this locally. So that is a simple button that says login with Netlify identity. Then it asks us for the development instance. So I'm on localhost. It doesn't know what Netlify instance I have. So over here, remember when I enabled Netlify identity, it's on this particular site. So I should just take this instance and drop it in here. I think I need the HTTPS, and then I'll set it. So yeah, that's and now it's telling me it's in local dev, and I can do the same sign up and login dance as well. But let's say I want to turn off that confirmation email workflow, and that's what we're going to cover in terms of the setting. So here I'm allowing sign up, but I can equally say, all right, I don't want people to sign up. I don't want any Tom, Dick, or Harry to sign up. I just want invite-only signups. So now when I refresh this project and I try to log in, it only gives me a login option and there's no sign-up option. So in order to sign people up, I have to go into the invite page, to the identity page, and then invite users, and then type in their emails, and then they can sign up. So that's a much more sort of locked down version of identity. Obviously, I don't use that too often for demos, but when you want to, let's say, invite only after people have paid you, that's the way to do it. So I'm going to toggle that back to open. And the other thing I wanted to talk about also is confirm versus not confirm. So that's all the way down here. Here's where you can customize the templates that get sent out for email templates. But here in particular is where you want to turn off the auto confirm. So allow users to sign up without verifying their email address. So good. And now when I refresh this locally and I try and log in, I can now sign in. Swyx 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at netlify.com, whatever Let me add a plus to this, and then Swyx, sign up. And it just logs me in directly. There's no confirmation step. So that's good for sort of less secure identity use cases where you just want to, get people on board as quickly as possible. And then the last thing that you want to know about in the settings is the social providers. So external providers, there are 4 that come by default with Netlify. They're open issues for more. You can contribute that if you want to help out in open source. But these are things that we set up for you. And you can obviously set up your own via OAuth and functions. That's just going to add Google. By default, you can use the Netlify's version, and that's totally fine. Or you can use your own app as credentials. And that just involves adding a bunch of secrets and stuff. And I'm going to add in GitHub as well. These are the 2 I usually use, and obviously feel free to add the other 2 if you need them. But what that translates to is Netlify Identity is going to read those settings and then offer those as login solutions. So these don't directly redirect back to your local host. So what happens here is when I click this, it goes to GitHub, and then GitHub responds with confirmation, and then Netlify redirects the user to the production site. And so that might be a little bit tricky to test, but just as long as you're aware that it's redirecting you to the production site, you should be good to go from there. It also takes this access token, and if, for example, the widget was installed on this production site, the widget will also strip this access token from the URL and log you in. So just so you know, you can take that access token and swap it out, or take the production URL and swap it out for your local host. So localhost 1234, for example, for here, and that will log you in as Swyx, and that's just the Netlify Identity widget taking over for local development. To do anything interesting with the login information, you probably want to use JavaScript to do that. So let's look at how to add the Netlify Identity widget to our React app so far. What I'm going to do is going to import the React script into index.html. And then I'm going to get rid of this script just because now we're using the npm imports. You can see the docs over here on how we're going to do that. So we're not going to use the CDN based import anymore. And we can get rid of this button. So now if we reload, we should see our React app embedded inside of our page. And that's great. Okay. And now let's try and import Netlify Identity from Netlify Identity widget. We need to do some setup, and the docs should give you a clear idea of what is required. You can basically run Netlify Identity.init, and that should basically be a good enough setup. And then we're going to call the login function. So basically, I'm going to add a new button something, and then that will be a login button. So let's write the click handler, handle click equals to Netlify Identity dot open, and that's the open modal. And then we'll register a callback. Once a login event happens, we'll take the user. And we'll just say some sort of welcome, like console.log welcome user. Okay. And now let's use that button on click equals blah 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 login. All right, so that should give us a nice little login thing, but then also log out a welcome page. So let me log out again, and I'm going to log in. And it says welcome over here twice because there's 2 login events that are firing. But it doesn't matter. You can now see the full information inside of JavaScript, and you can render it. So for example, you can say something like user and user dot user metadata dot full name. It says user is not defined. Oh, right. Okay, so in order to get access to this user outside of the scope of the click handler, you do need to say user equals to Netlify identity dot current user. And that should give you a nice little, show up your name when you're logged in, and it will show nothing when I log out. I may need to trigger a refresh. There you go. Anyway, so I trust that you're able to build a full React app from there with all the authentication pieces. Definitely check out the examples inside of Netlify Identity Widget if you need React or Vue examples. Essentially, that's what I wanted to show you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about metadata. So you see a little bit here that we're using the metadata, but I haven't really explained it. And I guess now it's a really good time to explain it. So there's two types of metadata. The one's app metadata, and one is user metadata. And that just refers to who can edit that information. So user metadata is very powerful. I think it's underused, and we should all use it more. User metadata lets you store essentially preferences from the user, and the user can edit it. And the app metadata, the user cannot edit it, and it's only available to the app developer to add things like roles and provider source of information. So like if I logged in through GitHub, then this provider would say GitHub. So that's just to show the type of user and some metadata about the user from the app point of view. And then from the user point of view, they can set their own information down in there. So there's another way to manually do that, which is head over to the identity page, and you can also set your own user metadata down here. And I can just say like an admin role, for example, potato. You can save that. And when I reload, I should be seeing, probably have to log in again. I should be seeing that my app metadata has new roles for admin and potato. And this, you can gate your functionality based on this. So the other thing is you can actually use JavaScript and throw in more fields on here. And so that would involve, that's not functionality that Netlify Identity Widget offers you. And that leads us to a discussion of GoToJS and friends. So what Netlify Identity Widget is, it's actually a high-level widget, right? It comes with its own user interface. And it's actually an abstraction over a smaller underlying service called GoTrue. And here is the GoTrue, here is the GoTrue link. And this is the underlying platform on which the user identity service is being run. So Netlify Identity is kind of what the marketing term for the product is, but GoTrue is the underlying open source project where you can run your own authentication service. So this is written in Go, not very accessible to JavaScript people. So then we have a library on top of that called GoToJS. And GoToJS is a very, very small library that basically reflects the capabilities of the GoTrue functionality. So it just kind of reflects the APIs of all this. And so here is where you want to update, for example, the user attributes and add any metadata that you may want to use. So GoToJS is very low level, and you may want to write something in between. So if this comes with no user interface and has a lot of docs down here, and so choosing between something with a user interface and choosing something with no user interface at low level, there may be some in between that you may wish for. So we also have, this is something I maintain, React Netlify Identity, which is the React bindings for GoToJS. And that just provides GoToJS as a React hook, as well as a context that you put over your app. So you just provide the context, provide the instance, and you can use it as a React hook. So that's a very nice way to use the GoToJS. And then if you want to bring your identity widget with React, you can then use React Netlify Identity Widget. I know there's so many libraries, but these are meant to help rather than hurt. I'm just trying to show you how to choose between them. So this is the exact same. It's a port of Netlify Identity Widget, but because you don't have to ship your own framework, it's a lot lighter. So it's only 6 kilobytes, and it's got all the functionality of React Netlify Identity. You can use your identity as a hook, and it has a nice user interface that you don't have to code up. And obviously, you can bring your own styling if you want to. This is all optional. For Gatsby users, there's also a plugin for Gatsby that just basically helps you figure out the details behind wrapping the identity context provider for Gatsby. You don't really need it, but it's just a nice to have. Okay. So those are the ecosystem of libraries all around authentication, just trying to make your life a little easier. But the two main libraries to be aware of are GoToJS and Netlify Identity Widget, and then the React versions of that if you care to use them. They may save you some time. They certainly save me some time. Let's spend some time talking about the integration between Netlify Identity and Netlify Functions. And it's very integrated, so that's the very, very nice piece. What we'll do here is we'll look at the functions that we have, and we'll create a function that will be useful for our demo purposes. So I'm using Netlify Dev, and this is my alias for Netlify Functions Create. And we're going to go for the authenticated protected function template. And this is just a nice way so that I don't have to memorize how to do this. I can just fire it up and it'll just give me a basic template that does that. So you can see here that what it's essentially doing is that Netlify places the user, if they're logged in, on the context, and then checks if the context, if the user exists. If the user does exist, then a response is auth true. If the user does not exist, then it responds with a 401 and a console log that's a little bit snarky. So the way to run this is to have, in local development, Netlify Dev, again, I have an alias. And so that runs the functions together with the front end. And so now let's test this by using Netlify Functions Invoke. So NTL Functions Invoke. And that will let us choose the protected function trigger. And here we can finally understand what it means to have emulated Netlify Identity authentication headers. So by default, we're actually passing yes. So I'm just going to hit yes. And it says data auth true, which is that's what is reflected over here. So you can develop your functions as you go along, and this will live reload. And if you want to see what happens when there's no identity, actually to skip all that functionality, you can actually just pass in the name of the function. So function, so no identity. Yeah. And it says data not allowed, and also logs out no claims be gone. So that's great for developing. And once you're happy with your function, you can actually integrate that with your front end. So here I still have my front end continuing, still have my front end going. let's actually see how to wire it up with the protected function. So over in index.js, I have my click handler over here. So let's make a little ping. So like a new click handler. Handle click 2 equals 2. And that will get the current user as well. And here in the user object, we have this very interesting thing called the token. And we can use this access token to make requests. So let's make a little request over here. So fetch so it's .netlify /functions/ what did I call it? Protected function. And then we have to supply some headers. So headers, authentication, bearer, user dot token dot access token dot then console log. So actually I misspelled that. I need to make this authorization, and I need to .json it, .json, and then I can console log it. All right, let's wire up the button click for this to happen. And now instead of regular dev server, I have to run the Netlify dev server. So notice that the serverless functions are being served on port 34567, and then the parcel server is being served on port 1234, and both of them are being joined on localhost 8888. So that's the one I actually want. And if I go to 1234, that is not going to have a working function for me because there's no proxy to redirect the functions. So I'm on localhost 8888 right now, and I have that new button. Let's call it something better, like off function. All right. So now when I click it, let's see the response that I get back. All right. So I click the off function. It sends off to my backend, which is running. Which decodes the JSON web token that I attach from my bearer token, and then I can do stuff with that data inside of the serverless function, and then respond back with whatever I want. Here I'm responding with auth true, but you can respond with anything that you want. Let me log out, and let's see the equivalent response for that. All right, I'm clearing all this as well. So now I'm not logged in, and I'm going to try and do off function. It says cannot read property token of null. That's very true. So let me just say something like user and headers. So if I'm not logged in, let's see what will happen. So it says unauthorized over here. So we can have a catch, for example. And it would say, you should log in. You should log in. In fact, you can do something really cool and have a little gate on this piece of information over here. So something like x.data equals not allowed. We can just prompt for a login. If not, we can just console log out the information. So now we're not logged in, and if I try to do this function, which requires a login, it's going to ping my backend and be denied, and then come back and immediately ask for a login. So that's a pretty cool integration of serverless functionality and authentication. Now that's not the only integration. There's some other integrations as well. If you check over for event-triggered functions, there's 3 that we're going to be talking about that are triggered, well, based on events. And we can look for them in the functions docs. And if you scroll down to event-triggered functions, you can see a whole list of them. But I just wanted to highlight the identity-based ones because those are extremely useful. for doing anything when people sign up or log into your site. So we're going to try and scaffold out an identity function just to see how that works together with your function and Netlify Dev and identity workflow. So I'm using Netlify functions create, and we'll pick the identity signup template and create a template like this. And it pretty much ships with a lot of decent boilerplate already. And one thing you'll notice is that it's called identity signup, and that's a hard-coded name. These are all special names which are recognized by Netlify functions, and they'll get triggered when certain events happen. So on this one, identity signup, well, it happens when signup happens, and you can decode or destructure from the body and look at the user object and then assign different parameters like metadata on the object. So as you're developing your event-triggered functions, I highly recommend testing it locally first before pushing it to production, because you might run into bugs that you didn't catch, and it's better to catch bugs faster so that you have a faster development cycle. So the best way to do that is in Netlify Dev. So I'm going to start up Netlify Dev on one side, and this will start up the functions server. And on the other side, we're also going to start up a function invocation. So here, we're going to parse sample data. So we just need to parse in. One thing that makes this different from normal Netlify functions testing is that it has extra information on the user, right? Like this user.email.whatever. So Netlify Dev understands that and has a special hard-coded behavior for these functions. So here we're going to try and invoke the Netlify identity signup. And instead of the usual prompt, we're going to get just a sample payload passed into the function. It's going to run through that code, and it's going to return with, for example, here we've passed in a user with trustthiscompany.com. So it's going to pass in, so it's going to return with app metadata of roles of editor. And with some extra functionality as well assigned dynamically inside of the serverless function. And you can also test this in production by dropping out of Netlify Dev and pushing it to production. So here it would be Netlify deploy prod. My shortcut for that is ndeploy. So I will just do that. So now when you click on the site and you look at the deploy logs, you should see that it's uploading 3 functions. And the third function that is being deployed is the identity signup function. That's great. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So we'll head over to the production site that we just deployed. And we'll try to have some sort of person sign in. So let's try to sign up as someone from Trust This Company. Actually, let's just sign up as a total stranger and let's see what happens with that. Stranger at danger.com. Stranger. We already turned off the confirmation email, so I can just put in a non-existent email. It's totally fine. And I'm logged in as a stranger. That's totally fine now. And let's have a look at what the metadata comes back as. So let's see the metadata over here. So we logged it out. And here we have strangedanger.com. And we have been assigned the roles of visitor. And that's in alignment with what happened with our identity signup function, which validated the user email and said, oh, this doesn't come from my company. It comes from stranger at danger.com. So I'm going to give this a role of visitor. So that's something that only the app can do and the user cannot do. But the user can supply extra metadata around that to store some preferences or something. And these are all things that they can adjust and you can access on the user metadata object. So that's good. Let's sign out and let's sign in as someone from the company. So employee E8675309. And so employee at trustthiscompany.com. So I'm just following here. So this will pass the validation and we expect it to get an editor access. So employee, whatever. So I signed up. I can close this. And now when you look at the sign-in information, I'm employee at justiscompany.com, and that's accordingly I've been given better permissions as a editor rather than a visitor. And again, I can do some dynamic data as well and check my information as a user. So those are event-triggered functions. You can use identity sign-up to assign roles, just like we showed. You can use that to set up a new field in a database. You can use identity validate to reject people from even signing up because of some other blacklist or some other rules that you may have. And there's identity login for doing things when people log in. One important caveat that I want to share with people is that identity sign-up only fires for email and password sign-ups right now and doesn't fire for external providers. So you'd have to make a separate trigger for that using Netlify functions. But it's relatively straightforward to set up. We have an open issue for this on GoTrue, and you're welcome to contribute if you can. But that's what stands right now as to the limitations of the event-triggered functions on Netlify. Okay, so we already talked a little bit about metadata management and how that works together with functions. So before we finish this section, once you may wish to also retrieve the form data after sending it in. So there's a couple ways to do that. One of the clearest examples is this demo done by Phil Hawksworth called Jamstack Comments. So this is a demo for Jamstack Comments with Netlify forms and functions. And you can leave comments here. It would get posted to a review queue. And these are all then pulled from the forms submission data back into the site and generated from there. So if you're keen on that, definitely have a look at the source code. It's going to be somewhere inside this gulp file. And you can just see that you put together some of these environment variables, which are also documented inside of this project, hit the right API endpoint, and then you can do whatever you want with it. So that's the rough idea behind retrieving the form submission programmatically. Obviously, you can download it via CSV or other manual processes if you want. And for further documentation, you should definitely have a look at the Open API of Netlify. And that's down here. And then you can scroll down to the forms section where you can find every single endpoint and what they offer. So these are very, very good sources of finding out and building out your feature that you desire. And we'll have a piece at the end of this series about the Netlify API and how you can build your own Netlify clients with this whole thing. Okay, so on to the last piece of this video, which is the paid features, just to briefly mention that they exist and what you can do with them. So the first is branded OAuth. So branded OAuth is relevant to this part of the identity settings, where you can see, where site visitors can see your own app and it doesn't have to mention Netlify. Remember when we signed up with GitHub and Google as external providers, we used the Netlify identity app, but we could actually use our own app and do our own automation and settings with that. There's also SSO features. This is alongside the role-based access control on the business plan, and you can also upgrade it individually on the identity plan for just Netlify identity by itself. The same goes for audit logs for checking, for understanding who's signing in and out of your site. So for example, when I go over to the site that we've been working with, I have all these people logging in and out. I can just head to the identity audit log and see all the sign in and out actions over here to see if there's something fishy going on. And lastly, we're going to customize the custom sender as well. So a custom outgoing email address, so it doesn't come from netlify.com when people want the email confirmation. So that's probably not everything, but those are the main features I figured I should highlight that if you need to for a production application, you can definitely pay for it. But everything else that we presented is completely free. So that's pretty nice. And that's Netlify Identity. The best way for me to explain Netlify CMS is to show it to you in action. Netlify CMS is an open source project that is worked on by employees on Netlify, but is completely separate as far as technology is concerned from Netlify, except for one connection point, which is the Git gateway. You can use Netlify CMS without Netlify, and there's some documentation on that. We're just going to show why you might pick it over some of the other headless CMS options. And the key is to understand that it's a Git-based CMS. So there's no extra server to pay for or maintain. It's all within your Git together with your source code. There's an explanatory video here with more details, but we're going to be going over much of that in our course today. And so let's actually see this in action. Netlify uses Netlify CMS, of course, especially for the blog, for example. So here, these are blog posts that are drafted and published and previewed and edited all in Netlify CMS. And that's a very wonderful thing. So let's take a look at how this works internally. In the URL, there's a special endpoint that we've set up called /admin endpoint, and that gets us to the Netlify CMS admin panel. And Netlify CMS with the Git gateway uses Netlify identity to log in. We'll explain all this integration. But fortunately, you already know what Netlify Identity is, and this is a very familiar widget to you by now. I'm going to sign in with my employee email and my password. And now we can see the admin backend of Netlify. So we have a few collections named here and some blog posts. And also you're able to see them sort of spread out or in layers. We haven't really set it up. We just put titles on just because that's all we need. You can also see workflow and media, and we'll talk about those two in turn. But let's go ahead and start a new blog. And I'm just going to cancel. And so you can see here two things. There's a left-hand side with a bunch of form fields, and on the right-hand side, a preview. And so this is very cool. It's actually a full React app that looks exactly like our blog. So let's have a sample post. Test posts, please ignore lorem ipsum. I have my author picture pre-registered, so my author picture shows up as well. And note if I change the date, it shows up on both sides. You can select a pre-generated topic. You can add terms. I can type in some text, but then I can also write in Markdown, which is very nice for code. I can even configure custom fields, like for example, this tweet field, which will show what the tweet looks like, describe in some metadata. There's a special field in this editor interface where you can actually add images as well, which is not usual for Markdown editors, but you can do that right here. And you can choose a new image to upload. For example, I can upload a recent image of mine, and I can select it to be included, and that will show up in my preview, which is very nice. Me. And I can collapse this and keep editing my content down below. So all this is very nice, and this is especially if you're working with non-technical audience, but then also just for yourself if you write a lot and you just want a nicer editing experience. You can notice the scroll sync as I go up and down, which is very, very cool. And so yeah, once I'm happy, I can save. And with Netlify CMS, that does a couple things. That actually kicks off a PR that sends to the GitHub repo of netlify.com. And then it immediately has the status over here to check for a preview. So right now, this is in a draft mode because I just saved, I haven't published. And I can set the draft status to in review or ready as well. And we'll talk about the editor workflow. But first, let's talk about this check for preview tag. So what this does in the backend, let's have a look at the source code for the www. So you can see that Netlify bot has already created a Netlify CMS page It's adding that file that I did in Markdown. The image that I had already was uploaded, and you can see the deploy preview down here working on the build. So this is why there's a check for preview button, because you can click this if you want and continually check for preview. There's no preview yet, so this is still showing check for preview. But this is for basically eliminating any differences between the WYSIWYG preview and the final article. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can set up the correspondence between the in-panel sort of live preview as well as the deploy preview, which is almost basically the real thing. Like, you know that based on continuous deployment, once you merge this PR in, it will look exactly like it does in the preview. Once that deploy is live, you can actually see that status update in the PR and obviously collaborate with your coworkers inside a PR. But also inside the CMS, you can actually hit check for preview again, and it will turn into a view preview button. And when you view the preview, this will be a deploy preview with your post exactly as it will be inside of your actual content. And you can see the entire site index together with that, which is very nice. So let's talk a little bit about editor workflow. I'm going to hit back and check out the workflow section. So the post that I've made is now in the draft section, together with some of the content that I have. I can delete, I can publish, I can drag it through. If, for example, I have a reviewer that I'm working with, or I'm just sort of working this in progress, whereas this is just more of an icebox. And once it's ready to publish, I can just take this over to the ready section and either automatically publish it or manually hit the publish button whenever I'm ready to launch my new blog post. Over in the media section, we can check on the images that I've uploaded. Nothing much else here. But now let's talk a little bit about how it's configured. How come we can upload both images as well as Markdown? And that's actually all in the configuration that's contained within the repo itself. So here I'm in the backend of the blog page, and NetlifyCMS has a special config file called config.yaml. And here you basically spec out all the details that NetlifyCMS needs to know about your site. So we'll talk about collections later, but that's basically the schema of all the content that you enter in. But basically, you specify your backend, your site URL, your publish mode, which we opted into editorial workflow for a more fine-grained process, as well as specifying a media folder, which is where we want the GitHub bot to store our uploaded images, and the public folder, which is where we're going to serve our images from. So a lot of times, this is a nested folder, so we just want to tell NetlifyCMS where to actually expect it. So that's the difference between the media and the public folder. Let's talk a little bit about what this word backend means. That's a verboten word in Netlify, but really we're just using one of many configurations for integration with Git providers. So obviously the one that we lead with is Git Gateway, which integrates with Netlify Identity. We'll talk about this. And this has to be measured in contrast with the others, which is integrations with GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket. So let's have a look at these backends. What's common among GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket is that all your CMS users need to have commit access through the authentication services of each of these services. So GitLab, you need to log in with your GitLab account. Bitbucket, same thing. And GitHub, same thing. And then they can commit. Obviously, you may not want to give everyone commit rights to your code. You may just want them to be able to send in content and let the bot take care of it. And that's what Git Gateway does for you, together with Netlify Identity. And that's the tight integration there. Fortunately, you know everything about Netlify Identity already. So what I'm going to show you is just the documentation for Git Gateway, which is over here. and it explains how you can set it up if you don't want to use Netlify, because this is an open source project, and you can see all the source code over here in the Git Gateway repo. So to be clear, you don't need Netlify Identity to use Netlify CMS. It's just a nice to have because you want your publishers and your authors and your editors to be able to review content without being able to commit to code. And in all these other options, you have to give them commit rights because that's how it would work. Okay, so that's it for our intro to Netlify CMS. But we're going to get our hands dirty a little bit and actually set a new thing up from a template. So that's the best way to start with it. And I don't know if I've been clear enough at the beginning, but Netlify CMS does not depend on React. It uses React for the editor, but it's amazingly tech agnostic. Like it works with Hugo, it was Jekyll, Middleman, Gatsby. And that's pretty freaking amazing given that it's also showing you a live preview. But it is true that the largest number of users come from the Gatsby and React ecosystem. So we're going to have a look at how to set that up. So one thing we're going to start from is a template, and that's the template that's maintained by the Netlify CMS team. I do want to pay some special attention to the URL of this template, of this deploy to Netlify button. So if you watched my earlier videos, you should be aware of what the deploy to Netlify button does. But basically it helps you set up a fork. Here we're actually doing something new, which is appending this @stack equals CMS flag. And that just basically helps to set up a Git gateway plus Netlify identity setup just from a single deploy to Netlify button click, which is the standard one that you see with any Netlify open source site. Okay, so let's deploy from a template. So I'm going to click here, and it's going to set up that one-click deploy that we all know and love. So I signed in, and now it's creating a repo name. I'm just going to leave it unchanged. Actually, I already have the same name here, so I'm just going to add a 2 to it. But notice that it's actually showing that it's going to set up Git gateway and identity as well, just because we added that little tag at the end of @stack equals CMS. If you didn't have this, you could set it up yourself just by clicking a few buttons, but this just makes it a one-click deploy type of situation. So that's always very handy to have, especially when getting started with something. Okay, so we have a new site, and just for good measure, we can see that identity is already set up for me, as well as in the settings, I can see that Git gateway is already set up as well. And that would be in settings, identity, all the way down here with the Git gateway services. And you can set this up yourself if you choose. Let's actually take a quick look at what this one clean deploy gets us. So let's head over here. So we get a nice landing page with some content down here that hopefully we can customize, as well as some stories from a blog. And you can read more on the /blog. And obviously here we see that lazy loading fanciness from Gatsby. But otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward blog that you can see. There's also a products page that you can edit, and a contact page with Netlify forms and other form examples down below. Let's take a look at what that looks like from the source code perspective. So when I clicked that deploy to Netlify button, I also cloned that source code. And again, in the Netlify CMS world, you should always start with the config.yaml file. So let's have a look at the static folder, admin route config.yaml. It's pretty much always in a route like that, where the final route will be foobar.netlify.com/admin, right? And then it will just look for a config.yaml up in there. We got the backend config file. And again, just to note that all this is actually in the docs. We're not really covering anything new here. I'm just explaining it as I go along in words that I could understand. So here we're setting the backend with the Git gateway. There's other backend options that we already talked about. And Then we have a media and public folder. Again, already explained that this is where you want to store it inside of Git, and this is where it's going to live in the public URL. And now we come to these concepts of collections. And so we want to talk about collections, folder collections versus file collections. Folder is actually the easier one, and folder you can think about as just templates for your blog, right? So when I edit my blog, I want to be able to specify a date, have that be broken out to year, month, day, and slug, and the slug will be created for me. The template key can be given to me as well, and I can have some other fields like description, featured posts, and you can notice that I'm using all these widgets, which are text, boolean, image, markdown list, date, time, and these are all default widgets that come with Netlify CMS. So let's have a look at the widgets, and these are all the common widgets. You can see the options available to you and some notes on how they behave. And let's have a look at them in action, because I feel like we're still too abstract in terms of what we're doing over here. So let's fire up the page and let's go to admin. Now I haven't set this up for invites, so here it's only login. So I need to let it be able to sign up. Obviously you want to be very careful with this, because once people sign up, they can also contribute content. And you don't want just anyone to sign up. So let's change our registration preferences to open. And I'll just go ahead and add like a GitHub external provider as well. And as you know, the Netlify identity widget will pick that up. So now I can sign up, or I can just also continue with GitHub. And I'm just going to make a new blog post and just walk through that process again. But this time, we're going to have the schema open in front of us and compare them from side by side. So here we'll see that we have a title. The template key is hidden, and this determines the layout in Gatsby's perspective. We'll look at the title, and we'll try and say lorem ipsum. We'll have a publish date with the datetime widget. There used to be a date widget, but now that's deprecated, so you always use the datetime widget. That doesn't seem to display in our template over here, and we can go fix that if we want to. The description, I can just say foo, bar, baz, whatever. Featured posts, yeah, make it a featured post, why not? I'll check an image, I can reuse a selected image, or I'll just make my own, because why not? Okay, chuck that in there. Upload, choose selected. And I'll type in some text. I'll just grab some of this stuff, hook it in there. Maybe I'll make this a markdown thing. Okay, cool. And that looks like some content. And tech, JavaScript, whatever. Publish it. Notice that I don't have editorial workflow set up. So when I publish, it immediately creates that PR. It's currently rebuilding, so give me a sec. Let's head to the deploys. So you saw me cancel that deploy over there because I'm just uploading the image. I actually need to build the blog. One thing that we can look at while this is building is also look at the PR that's happening in our project. So over here, there's no PR because we haven't set up editorial workflow, but the code has actually committed it directly for me. Including that date time that I talked about, as well as the description, featured posts, all those fields that we specified in our config. Okay, so the new site is live, and we'll go over and refresh, and we should be able to see the new blog post, and there's no date in the preview, and that's as planned. So the other type of collection, so that's the folder collection that we talked about over here, and that's basically setting up all these templates to go into each of these blog post folders that have been declared. And that's a pretty clear and intuitive way to use a CMS. The other way to use this Netlify CMS is as a file collection. And here we call our file collection pages. And we've got a bunch of different pages. We've got the landing page, we've got the about page, we've got the products page. And the idea here is that there will not be repeated copies of these. These are just individual files. And we're using the CMS as a way to edit the content of these files dynamically. And Netlify CMS will be smart enough to handle that. So let's have a look at how that works on the inside. Again, we're going to go into the content manager. And so the blog, as we maintain over here, is the folder collection, and the file collection is all these pages, which we named over here. We head to the pages, and we can edit any one of these things. So I'll just edit the landing page. The landing page has these widgets set up on the left, and this preview on the right, which, as you already saw, is pretty much the exact same as what is in production. So we can just say Netlify CMS is really great. CMSing without a CMS server. And we can blah, blah, blah. Look at all of this awesomeness of widgets and editing and WYSIWYGness. This is really, really hard to do. I honestly don't know how they do this. But I'm glad that they do. So let's save this. Again, it's directly hitting to publish. We can obviously set up the editorial workflow by configuring that inside of the field over here. Just add a editorial workflow field. And now when I look at the commits again, I should be able to see the latest commit that we're updating the pages of the title and subheading. And that does, again, hooks right back into Netlify and kicks off a new build. Okay, so that's about it. The last piece that we didn't cover is the filter field. That's going to be very handy for basically filtering out by language. So for example, I want to edit in English or Spanish and have different layouts and widgets for those things. Those are very, very helpful as well. And probably the most common question for most blogging situations is needing to schedule posts. Because there's no running server, you need a way to make blog posts go live at a point in time. So the natural solution is to set your blog post date at some point in the future, and then you set up your builds to run every day, every minute, every hour, whatever it is. And once that time has passed for the blog post to be published, then that build will pick it up. So essentially, all you need to do is set up a cron job. And Zapier is a really good way to do it. So the Zapier integration with Netlify lets you just use the Zap, and you can start a deploy of Netlify sites on a daily schedule, which is pretty cool. There are other methods to do it. This article from Flavio Copes essentially tells you about the Zapier integration with a little bit more documentation and screenshots, which I highly recommend. And for those who want to try out something more serverless without paying for Zapier, you can try to set up your own with serverless framework. And literally scheduling a publish is as simple as leaving a comment inside of GitHub. So those are very interesting ways to schedule posts. But essentially, if you were paying attention during the Netlify build section where we talked about build hooks, then you can essentially fire off from any old device. You can have a Raspberry Pi that sends a ping to your build server, all of that good stuff. The last section of what we're going to cover today has to do with media. So far we've been uploading media directly to our Git folder. That obviously has scalability issues for large images and large numbers of images. And so you may want to explore one of the media partners that we have. So probably the best known is Cloudinary. Cloudinary essentially lets you sign up for free, and then they'll manage your images for you. All you need to do is add a media library key to your config.yaml and give them your Cloudinary cloud name as well as your API key. And that's about it. Netlify will upload there instead of your GitHub. Similar principle for Upload Care. Upload Care is another service that just focuses on asset storing, and not just images, but just everything in general. in a similar place, similar thing. You just sign up for them and then give your public key. And lastly, we'll talk about Netlify Large Media, which actually is a Git LFS implementation. So you don't store your images inside of Git. You actually store it somewhere else in a Netlify Large Media server, and then Netlify will proxy and give you the right sizes of your images, audio, video for you without bloating your repository. So we'll actually talk about that in the next section on Netlify add-ons for everything else. But apart from that, you should be all set to go to set up your site with Netlify CMS. Okay, now we're on to the Netlify add-ons section. This is going to be a relatively quick section because a lot of these are just show and tell demos. And also, it's a very growing field. It's probably the absolute newest out of all of these different sections that we've covered so far. And let's just get right into it. So the first one is Netlify Analytics. This was just launched in June of 2019, and it's server-side analytics. And you can check out the product page over here and get a gist of what it's talking about. But the main idea is that because it's server-side, it's unblockable. Because you have to serve the files for people to access your site. And if they access your site, and if we serve the file to them, then they're definitely a visitor. And that's important because a lot of us use ad blockers like Privacy Badger and uBlock Origin to block our ads. So here's a way to get past that and get real numbers, but then also avoid tracking personal information because Netlify Analytics simply doesn't accept personal information, so you can't track it. So the best way to get started is just to go to any site that you have and just hit to the analytics section on the top. And you can read through this and click to enable analytics for $9 a month. You can fill that out, but I already have that filled in my other site, so I'm going to go to there. It is per site. As for right now, obviously work with the salespeople if you need better pricing than that. And you can also read the documentation for more information about what each of these numbers mean. That's going to be extremely important. So here's my own personal site. I can see total page views for the past 30 days, unique visitors, and total bandwidth used. Unique visitors is an important question, and we'll come to that. So these are daily numbers, and these are monthly numbers. Daily numbers are I had a spike on September 14 when I had a big blog post go out. Unique visitors, how do we tell unique visitors if we don't track them? And this is straight up just unique IPs. And there's some pros and cons to that with regards to double counting. For example, if you're on a mobile phone versus on your desktop and you're on different networks, you have different IPs and you'll be counted twice. But then also you'll be undercounting people who share IPs. So for example, in a co-working space or a library or a airport or something. So it is by IPs. As long as you're comfortable with that and you can see the spikes here and there, you should be relatively comfortable with what the traffic numbers say about what's going on with your site. Additionally, something else that you can't see here is that when you actually turn it on, Netlify is able to backfill in time for the past 30 days and that's just because Netlify already has the server logs. It just hasn't set up the scripting for your site to spit out the analytics for you. So that has extra running costs, and that's what you're paying for to backfill. You don't have to enable it and then track. The limitation, of course, is that right now it only offers you 30 days. But that is definitely something that the team is keen on working on for offering you more than 30 days and rolling windows of stuff. So you might notice that unique visitors on a daily basis and a unique on a monthly basis kind of doesn't add up if you try to add every single day up. And that's intentional because these are unique over a month, whereas these are unique within a day. So that's all explained in the documentation, and you can definitely look at the specific definitions of what each of these numbers mean. And there you go. That's what they offer you. They can tell you what the top pages are. A lot of them will be sort of service worker type stuff. But then also, you can also look at things that are missing. So for example, if I forgot a mobile icon, that's a very good sign that I should probably put it there because people are checking stuff out on mobile. If they're checking out for my RSS, or if they're trying to hack me, I can also see what's going on over there. some pages will get a lot of bot sniffing for the WP admin login page. And that's just something that we, being Jamstack just guards against for you. And that's very nice. You may also want to filter out some of these commonly requested things which are not relevant to your site, and that those are functionality that is being worked on by the team, as well as you may want to offer client-side navigation because these are only server-side. This is where people land, but then subsequent navigations for people using front-end frameworks aren't being tracked. And again, that's another common feature request that hasn't been implemented yet. Still, this is a new feature and it's done very, very well. So the team is very keen on working on it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next add-on, which has a little bit more of a learning curve than clicking a button, which is large media. And to explain large media, I should have to explain what Git LFS is. Git LFS is a way to store large files together with versioning in Git. So everything that we love about Git, except that with Git, one of the problems is when you store large files in it, then everyone has to download it and it persists forever in history. And that's not very good, especially if you don't use it or access it very much. Like you just want to access it for content. So that's why you use Git LFS, and that's a spec that you can just clone, install, and use without Netlify. What Netlify does for you is provide a place to store it. So that's where Netlify Large Media comes in. And you can see the product page over here and learn a little bit about how to deal with the problem. Netlify Large Media also comes with the concept of image transformations, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But let's actually check out how to implement it. The best way to learn where to implement it is on the docs. The large media page has some information about it here, as well as some prerequisites, and it really is dependent on your CLI. So we have already introduced the CLI in various sections of previous videos, but this one is important. It's a plugin that you just install with the CLI. So now every time you add a large media file, you just have to say git LFS track and then the path to that media file. And you can use wildcards as well for entire folders. And Netlify will just upload that to Netlify servers when you commit. So your workflow is exactly like push and pull and all that. And let's have a look at what that looks like on our demo. So our demo over here has a bunch of images with high definition. And you can see the GitHub repo over here. And we can see how this is all set up with Git LFS. In the master branch, this is the one without Git LFS. So if you go into the static folders and look for the images and look at each of these images, they're just going to be the large images that we see over here. And here's some apples. And that's not very efficient. Obviously, that's not very scalable. This is fine for these small examples, but it's going to be out of control pretty soon, especially with images of a few megabytes or even gigabytes. And you can think about videos and audio assets as well over here. So what happens with this folder in Git LFS is when I switch over and I head to images and I look at one of these, I see that the file size is 386 kilobytes, but I see that it's been replaced by just a pointer. And now the pointer is just pointing to the Git LFS server, which in this case is Netlify Large Media. You can see the corresponding files tracked on the Large Media section of your site. So head over to the Large Media section, and then you can see all the files that are being tracked, as well as filter out for one of them if you have a lot of files. And that's very, very handy. And then the other capability of Netlify Large Media, and this is a special case for images, is that you can resize them. So there's no point serving high resolution images every time or manually resizing them by yourself. You could just use an API for that. And so Netlify provides that API, and it's called image transformation. Let's have a look at what that looks like over here. So I'm going to apply the parameters to this. And it's reduced it to a width of 100 and a height of 100. But this is a rectangular image, so it's just going to fit to that. I can also use the smart crop parameter, and that's actually going to be 100 by 100. And it uses the smart crop parameter. We can also make this, let's say 500 on the width, and that just gives you exactly what you want. So that's a very great way to just send over the wire exactly the subset of the image that you need. And you can change the parameters, whether you need to preserve the aspect ratio or you need to just fit exact dimensions if you need to. You can see more details about image transformation over on the documentation page, and especially on how to supply the query parameters to get the examples that you need. But it's going to be pretty straightforward once you understand what it does. So that's Netlify Large Media, relatively straightforward large file hosting and image transformation product. All right, that is that for image transformation and large media. And now we're on to even more exciting ground, which is the add-on marketplace. And this is a relatively new part of Netlify as well, which is working with third-party add-on providers. And it's not something we really shout about because there's just not a lot of them, and it's quite a new initiative. But it's definitely a growing area of focus for Netlify. And if you're interested in working on an add-on for your company together with Netlify, definitely get in touch. But we're just going to focus on 2 existing add-ons that you can use today. The first is going to be FaunaDB. A lot of people, when they move up in terms of use cases from marketing pages to submitting forms to authentication and CMS, and then they, at some point, they become an app and need some sort of persistence from a database. And you can use Firebase and other databases like MongoDB Atlas through Netlify Functions and Netlify Dev and all that good stuff. But it's easier to onboard with an add-on that manages a lot of the back-end syncing of environment variables and setting up of instances and all that. So it's all integrated in your Netlify Dev workflow. So here we'll talk a little bit about FaunaDB. So the FaunaDB, I think the best place to find out about it actually is not on Netlify. The best place to find out about it is on a podcast. One of my favorites is Software Engineering Daily, and Evan Weaver, the CEO of Fauna, talked about why he started Fauna. And basically, he was one of the early database engineers at Twitter, and they faced scalability problems because they were using NoSQL databases. Well, they had to migrate to NoSQL because they faced scalability problems. And so that's what Fauna is, a globally distributed ACID compliant database, and it has a lot of really nice features, including their own query language, which is very powerful for some use cases like field level authorization and GraphQL first support. So the best way to start thinking about how to use Fauna together with Netlify Functions is to look at some of the announcement posts. The Fauna add-on was definitely in the prototyping phase for a few months. And so in July, there was this example from David Wells talking a little bit about how to set it up from a Create React App point of view and setting up a full serverless databasey full stack FaunaDB enabled Netlify function. And that's the demo that you can view on the Netlify repo because it's the one done by Netlify people. And you can definitely think about the structure that you might want for a backend for your CRUD apps. And more recently, in September of 2019, we actually announced the full general availability of the add-on together with an authentication claims process. So now it's fully supported. So now it's fully officially supported by Netlify and Fauna. And the way that you add it, you can definitely create it through the Netlify CLI. And these are the commands: add-ons create Fauna, and then you can claim that instance with add-ons off. And the Fauna team themselves have also worked on a demo for you that can show off what you can do with it. And the idea of this demo is to show you how to integrate Netlify Identity, Netlify, and Fauna all in one full stack app. And obviously it's a to-do app because that's the hello world of everything. And we can log in, for example, with our Netlify Identity process that we know and love. And once we're logged in, you can see that we are able to create lists to do MVC. And I can access that list and add a list and do everything that you normally do with CRUD. and you can still go back out. This list would be guaranteed not to be accessible to other users because of how Fauna does field level authentication. So definitely check out how Fauna works. You can also look at their docs for the Fauna add-on specifically, or just getting started with Fauna in general. And it's a very powerful database with great developer experience for serverless Jamstack users. The next add-on we're going to look into is the Very Good Security, or VGS add-on. And VGS is a company. It's not just something that you should have. VGS is a company that solves a very real problem of a very different nature, which is collecting your users' data in a PCI and HIPAA compliant way. So there's some more information on the docs, but I'm just going to go through a rough intro of what you should know in case you might need this. And so the idea is that when you're using something like Netlify Forms, you might be collecting some information. So let's look at this demo on the VGS GitHub page. And it's also linked in the show notes. And over here, we can see that we're taking a form. We got some name information, all this stuff. And we don't want this to be submitted to us via Netlify Functions or Netlify Forms. We just want to send it on to do, for example, a processing check, like a background API check, and maybe take payment through Stripe or something. So what VGS does is an intermediary that steps in and wipes and replaces all of these fields with unique IDs. Those functions can then remotely check VGS for those values. None of it hits Netlify or Netlify's logging. So here we've processed a Stripe transaction, even though we haven't saved the user's data from credit card or other information. So that's the rough idea of why you might need it. Definitely go check out their introductory video just to explain a little bit more about what VGS does. They are very good at what they do. And they have more docs for you on the announcement blog post, as well as on the VGS doc site itself. So definitely go check that out. Okay, and just to wrap up the video, we are going to talk a little bit about the premium add-ons. And these are things that you might want to look into if your company relies on Netlify, especially for enterprises and large teams. And you might need some of these premium support and performance add-ons. And so the best way to find out information for that is to go to the pricing page and just to get an idea of like the security features, the performance features, the different CDNs. The free tier has a CDN that everyone uses, and then the enterprise tier has dedicated CDNs with more points of presence and better performance, as well as uptime SLAs. And you can also specifically add support add-ons. So there's dedicated response times and chat and support channels, as well as high performance application delivery network features that you might need for your high performance needs. So all of this is available on the pricing page, and you can contact sales for more information about that. I personally don't know too much, but it's good enough to know that it exists if your app or site needs it. And that's it. We've wrapped up our tour of Netlify add-ons. To be clear, everything else that we've discussed so far are also add-ons. It's just that there's more to do with each of them. So I broke them out into different videos. But Edge, Build, and Dev are core parts of the platform, and then each of these are add-ons, most of them with free tiers that you can use and add functionality to your app. But none of them are strictly required to use Netlify, and you can definitely bring other features as well. A lot of them are good partners with Netlify and sponsors of Jamstack events. One benefit of being Jamstack is that you're basically the first consumer of your own set of APIs. And once you have one consumer, you can pretty easily spread to more. So if you have a web app, you can spread to a mobile app, to a desktop app, to a CLI, and so on and so on and so on. And Netlify is no exception. Netlify itself is Jamstack, and Netlify.com is hosted on Netlify.com. So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at how to make your own Netlify client. And the best way to learn that is to look at the documentation and also to look at other clients that have already been implemented. And then you can implement a Netlify client for whatever purposes that you need. If something that we do is not working for you, you can make your own. So the first place to see this in action is app.netlify.com. This is always sort of the first class consumer of Netlify's APIs. And one way to tell is to go to the page and hit the network tab and just check out all the API responses that have been called. You can filter for XHR over here. And you can see that we're hitting, for example, like a sites endpoint with some parameters, and then that gets back the responses that are then displayed here, as well as notifications. Then when you enter a site, you get some notifications of deploys as well. So you get deploys. This is the options ping. Let's look at the get result, and yeah, you can see all the deploy preview stuff that's happening over here, and so on and so forth. There's a lot that's happening, and they're all done through an API, and therefore pretty transparent to anyone who wants to use them for other purposes. You should note that there are authentication tokens that you might want to forward, and this would be located in your Netlify Identity JWTs. Now that you know that the API exists, probably the best way to learn more about it is to check out the documentation. This is available on the official docs itself, and you can check out links for Go and JavaScript API clients. And it's got some information about rate limiting, pagination, and in particular, if you want to write your own deploy methods, you should read some of these information to help you figure out how to deploy large zip files and folders of files. Form submissions, that you programmatically retrieve form information. So you can retrieve that within a function, for example, and then reference it in your page itself. So it's not a write-only form. And there are other ways to trigger webhooks and retrieve files themselves without actually serving that URL. The official API itself follows the Open API spec and therefore has a programmatically generated documentation page as a standalone, and you can actually access this information in a structured manner together with some sample response shapes, so you can actually code faster for whatever use cases that you're thinking of. Another good client to look at is the CLI for Netlify, or Netlify Dev. So this is the CLI that you've been using. It's completely open source, which also means that you can also check out how to do certain things within the CLI and use them in your own Netlify client. The Netlify CLI is built on top of the Oak Cliff framework from Salesforce and Heroku. Therefore, there's a bunch of commands that are all located between here. And each of these are the commands that you run, including certain flags. For example, Netlify functions create. That would invoke some flags over here. But you can also look at, for example, the source code for Netlify deploy. And that's just a single file. And you can see how the CLI uses the this.netlify and this.authenticate instances to do things like getting sites and deploying deploying the sites and displaying the status of them. So all this wiring up between the CLI and the Netlify API happens off screen, and it may be a little hard to find. So I'm just going to do you the favor of pointing you directly at the Netlify CLI utils. So this is a separate package because it's used in multiple places. In the CLI utils, that basically links up the JS client, which is the JavaScript layer over the Go client for Netlify, and it wraps it inside of a Oak Cliff base command. And all of this is probably foreign to you right now, but it will be helpful if you need to dive into the code. But basically, we export a base command here, and we add on all the methods, like the authentication method that you saw us use earlier. We attach the Netlify instance by initializing and then attaching it onto that command's instance. So this library is useful for reusing the same login credentials on the machine for multiple clients. So if you're logged in on the CLI as well as desktop and so on, and you're not asked to log in multiple times. But if you want to go down to the lowest level of JavaScript dependency, definitely check out the JS client library. And this is the lowest level library that lets you do everything imperatively, but doesn't take care of access token usage for you. Some nice community clients that you can definitely check out as well. There's the menu bar app from Stefan Judas. This is the one I personally use. So if you click over here, you can actually see the reported incidents that have been happening recently. You can check out the different sites that you're managing and be notified of the deploys. You can toggle to different deploys or trigger a new deploy. You can set different settings for the app. And all in all, a very nice utility to have to give you notifications of when apps are deploying and updating. So that's a brief tour of the Netlify API. You're definitely welcome to use it and get in touch with us if you need some help on something that doesn't make sense. And we are interested in working with people to build more stuff. Like all of this is open source for a reason, and we're happy to work with people to do more things with Netlify. For example, a lot of people install the Netlify CLI as part of their continuous deployment process. Like they have their own continuous deployment toolchain and pipeline, and then they use Netlify CLI to just deploy the final build assets. But they don't really need it if they understood the lower level tools, or they could just build their own tools to do other things that they wish they could do. So Netlify API is the ultimate low level flexible interface if the interfaces that we have is preventing you from building and doing the stuff that you want to do. We made it. We're here. This is the final part of the Netlify series where we just link you to more stuff that you can learn. The first part I should probably tell you about is how to figure out if something is wrong with Netlify itself. That is the Netlify status. There is a netlifystatus.com page that is updated whenever there is a confirmed or reported incident. And you can check out the incident history if you think you've been affected in one of your sites, as well as subscribe to updates. There's also a Twitter account that you can follow to get more updates, or just check if you're in Twitter and you can get a link to what's going on over there. If you're not checking the status of Netlify, you are probably trying to debug something that's in your build. Unfortunately, a lot of build issues are user issues. So there's not a lot that we can do, but we can at least document some of the common gotchas. So this is actually in our docs that we document them. So this is actually in our docs, and these are common issues that people face. So we hope that some of this might help in terms of something that you're facing. In particular, my top tip is to make sure that you can run your build locally and it outputs what you expect before you deploy it and introduce continuous deployment to your build process. For even more self-service help, you can head to the Netlify community site, where there are people helping each other on Netlify issues as well as related static site generator issues. And for the FAQs, you can check out the common issue tag that has been created by the support team. And these are typical issues that they've run into supporting hundreds of thousands of developers over the past 5 years. If you're on a paid tier, you can have Netlify support. And depending on the tier, you can have support via email or Slack or Carrier Pigeon. It really depends on your pricing plan with Netlify. And lastly, if you need to check something with Netlify, you can also check them on Twitter, including getting a job with Netlify support. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually learned a lot from watching talks. So these are some talks I picked out to recommend to people for learning what Netlify does and is and Jamstack is about. Matt Billman gave this awesome talk at Smashing San Francisco in 2016, basically giving the founding thesis on Netlify, and it's all about what Jamstack does and why there is a resurgence in static site generators. Chris Coyer talked recently about how the front-end developers are now full stack developers because of everything that they've been enabled to do with the Jamstack. Sarah Drasner talked about how the Jamstack is a new way of joining together APIs, JavaScript, and markup. Just like the iPhone, it's not inventing anything new, but it's putting them together in a useful new way. And you can even do things like e-commerce with the Jamstack. And it's actually better because it's faster. Phil Hawksworth gives a really good talk on the agency perspective because of his many years of experience in agency life, and how it can lead to faster delivery times from a waterfall cycle to a more continuous approach. The Citrix team gave an incredible talk recently about migrating to Jamstack and Netlify with their docs team, and how their business processes and cost savings were very, very significant here for a large enterprise use case. Quincy Larson and freeCodeCamp aren't an enterprise, but they do have massive scale on the order of millions of users. And Quincy also talked about how he serves millions of users using the Jamstack because his number one priority is cost and scale. And that's a perfect fit for something like a Jamstack. And lastly, Jaman Ferguson of PayPal moved PayPal.me to Jamstack and recently gave a talk about it. And so this is an enterprise level talk, does not use Netlify, but still talks about the benefits and some problems with moving to the Jamstack that he solved. So these are all very good perspectives of real life use cases. I also learned a lot from how venture capitalists think about things. So the 4 places that I recommend people go to are the Andreessen Horowitz and Kleiner Perkins investment theses in Netlify, as well as Kleiner Perkins investment thesis. Redpoint and CRV are also interested in investing in the Jamstack ecosystem. So if you're interested in starting a Jamstack startup, you can check out their roadmaps and ecosystems and think about what parts of the ecosystem are lacking. CRV also has another Jamstack ecosystem chart, and I strongly recommend checking that out as well and thinking about where you fit and what you want to use and what you want to outsource. So that's the broad landscape of Jamstack. There are a couple more resources that I want to point you to learn more. First is JamstackConf.com. This is the premier Jamstack conference organized by Netlify, but definitely not exclusive to Netlify. There's Jamstack.org with even more resources about definitions, marketing material, best practices, examples, resources, and stuff. There's a Jamstack Slack that you can join at jamstack.slack.com. There's a older, broader community called the New Dynamic, and this is also a very active Slack channel. HeavyBit, one of the investors in Jamstack, also puts out a Jamstack radio podcast with a bunch of interviews that are really great. Just covering the Jamstack ecosystem as well as developer experience. And finally, Netlify recently published a book with O'Reilly on the modern web development with the Jamstack. And this is a free book. You just have to give your email, and it is a pretty good read on why the Jamstack, what is the Jamstack, and what you can do with it. So that's the summary of everything that I know about Netlify. Hopefully this whole video series has been helpful, and it's definitely the first iteration, so I'm keen on getting more feedback about it. And thank you for your time.